Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. Growing up on the East Coast, I was always drawn to the ocean. Maybe it was the way the waves seemed to move with their own quiet purpose, or how the salty wind carried whispers of things long forgotten. My grandfather used to tell me that the sea holds memories, that every wave, every gust of wind, and every shifting tide carries the weight of the past. I used to roll my eyes at his stories. Back then, they were just bedtime tales meant to spook a kid into staying close to shore. But as I got older, I started to wonder if he was right. It wasn't until last year that I truly began to understand what he meant. I work as a maritime surveyor, which means I spend a lot of time inspecting old coastal structures, piers, shipyards, and, on rare occasions, lighthouses. It's not exactly thrilling work, but I like the solitude. There's something about standing on an isolated stretch of land, staring out into the vast nothingness of the ocean, that makes you feel both completely insignificant and totally at peace. So when my supervisor called and asked if I could do a week-long assessment of an abandoned lighthouse off the coast of Maine, I didn't hesitate. The lighthouse was on a small island about 2 miles from the mainland. It had been decommissioned decades ago, and from what it read, the last keeper left under strange circumstances. The reports were vague, but there were mentions of erratic behavior, missing journal entries, and a single line in the final log that gave me pause. The light is out. I am not alone. It was probably nothing, just the ramblings of an old man losing his grip on reality. That's what I told myself as I packed my bags. The ferry ride to the island was uneventful. The sky was overcast, the water dark and restless beneath the boat. The captain was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, with deep-set eyes and a weathered face that looked like it had seen more than it cared to. He didn't say much on the ride over, just the occasional glance in my direction, as if trying to decide whether or not to warn me about something. When we reached the dock, he cut the engine and let the boat drift in silence before finally speaking. "You'll want to keep the light on at night," he said. I laughed, assuming he was making a joke. "The lighthouse isn't functional anymore." He didn't smile. "I know." There was something unsettling about the way he said it, but I brushed it off and stepped onto the dock. He didn't wait around, just turned the boat and headed back toward the mainland without another word. The island itself was exactly what I expected, rocky, windswept, and eerily quiet. There was an old keeper's house not far from the dock, a small, 2-story structure with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. Beyond that, the lighthouse towered above everything, its rusting frame standing defiantly against the gray sky. Inside the keeper's house, the air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and salt. The furniture was still there, a dusty armchair in the corner, a wooden table with a single chair, an old bed frame with a mattress that had probably seen better days. Someone had left a few belongings behind: a tin coffee cup, a rusted oil lantern, and a small, leather-bound journal sitting on the table. I flipped through the journal absent-mindedly, expecting old weather logs or mundane notes about supply shipments. But the handwriting became increasingly frantic toward the end, the words scribbled in uneven lines. The fog is getting thicker. I hear footsteps outside at night. The door was open this morning. I locked it before bed. The final entry was nearly illegible, the ink smudged as if the writer's hand had been shaking. "The light is out. I am not alone." A gust of wind rattled the window, and for the first time, I felt it, a strange, heavy stillness settling over the island. Like the air itself was watching me. I closed the journal and exhaled, shaking off the unease creeping up my spine. It was just an old book, filled with the ramblings of a man who had probably been isolated for too long. The mind plays tricks on people in places like this. With a sigh, I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the lighthouse. I had work to do. By the time I reached the lighthouse, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the rocky shore. The tower loomed over me, a rusting skeleton of iron and stone, its glass lantern room shattered in places, like an empty eye socket staring out toward the sea. I set my bag down just inside the entrance and took a moment to get my bearings. The interior was cold, even colder than outside, with a faint metallic scent hanging in the air. The staircase spiraled upward into darkness, disappearing beyond the reach of my flashlight. There was no electricity here. The wiring had long since deteriorated, so I relied on my flashlight as I moved through the lower level. The main floor was mostly bare, save for a few scattered tools and rusted equipment left behind by the last occupant. The air felt thick, heavier than it should have been, but I blamed the stale, unclosed space. As I reached the staircase, something made me pause. It was faint, so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it a sound, distant but distinct. A slow, deliberate creak from somewhere above me. I tilted my head, listening. Silence! Just the wind outside, moving through the broken windows. I exhaled and shook my head. Get a grip, I muttered to myself before beginning to climb. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step echoing up the hollow tower. The metal railing was cold under my hand, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into my bones. The higher I climbed, the stronger that strange metallic scent became, like rust and something else, something faintly organic. Reaching the lantern room, I stepped onto the platform and took a moment to take in the view. From up here, the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, rolling abyss swallowing the last light of the sun. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. Something about the air felt wrong, charged, like the quiet just before a storm. I turned my attention to the remnants of the lighthouse's beacon. The old Fresnel lens was cracked and clouded with dust, its metal frame corroded beyond repair. The entire structure was a relic, a forgotten monument to a time when this island had mattered. Now it was just a carcass, left to rot under the weight of the elements. As I turned to head back down, my foot froze mid-step. The dust! It was thick, untouched, undisturbed, like no one had been up here in years. Except for one thing. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the entrance to the edge of the platform, stopping just short of the railing. The impressions were deep, set into the dust as if someone had been standing there, watching the ocean. But there was something off about them. The spacing was unnatural, uneven, almost as if. I shook my head and forced myself to move. It was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks, making something out of nothing. Maybe the wind had disturbed the dust, shifting it just enough to create the illusion of footprints. That had to be it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I made it back down to the keeper's house, night had fully settled over the island. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending waves crashing against the rocks with an almost rhythmic intensity. I locked the door behind me, something I hadn't planned on doing when I first arrived. Sitting at the wooden table, I flipped through the old journal again, my fingers tracing the jagged lines of the final entry. The light is out. I am not alone. Outside, the wind howled. And beneath it, just for a second, I thought I heard something else. A slow, deliberate creak. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay in the narrow bed, the mattress stiff and unyielding beneath me, listening to the wind batter the old keeper's house. The wooden beams creaked with every gust, shifting like an aging body settling into itself. But it wasn't the wind that kept me awake. It was the footsteps. I heard them just after midnight, faint but unmistakable, slow, deliberate steps moving across the wooden floor of the lighthouse. At first, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the sound of the wind warping through the cracks in the tower. But the pattern was too distinct, too human. I forced myself to sit up, my breath tight in my chest. The room was dark except for the glow of my flashlight, casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. I listened, holding my breath, waiting for another sound. Silence! I exhaled and ran a hand through my hair, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. It had to be the wind. The structure was old, the floorboards loose. There was no one else here. There couldn't be. Still, the thought of walking out into the darkness unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I checked my watch, 12:37 a.m. I was exhausted, my body aching from the long day, but I knew I wouldn't sleep until I was sure there was nothing out there. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated at the door. Then, with a deep breath, I turned the handle and stepped outside. The air was thick with moisture, the salty tang of the ocean clinging to my skin. The moon hung low, casting a dull glow over the rocky shore. My flashlight cut through the darkness as I made my way toward the lighthouse, its beam trembling slightly in my grip. The door to the tower was still shut, just as I had left it. No signs of disturbance, no tracks in the dirt. I tried to convince myself that was a good thing, but somehow it only made me feel worse. Slowly, I reached for the handle. It was warm. Not just warm, hot, like metal left out in the sun. My stomach twisted as I yanked my hand away, staring at the door as if it would suddenly explain itself. The air was cool, the night damp and chilled. There was no reason for the handle to feel like that. I pulled my sleeve over my hand and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, stronger than before, an overwhelming metallic tang that coated the back of my throat. It was rust, salt, and something else I didn't want to name. My flashlight beam swept across the floor, illuminating the dust-covered surface. And the footprints. They were back. Deeper this time, as if someone had been pacing, dragging their feet across the wooden planks. My pulse pounded in my ears as I followed them with my light, tracking them to the staircase. And then I saw it. The railing. It had changed. When it'd been up here earlier, the metal had been rusted, brittle, its paint flaking away in long, curling strips. Now, it was wet. Dark streaks ran along the length of the handrail, glistening under my flashlight. Not water. Something thicker. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I should have left. Right then and there, I should have turned around, walked back to the keeper's house, and waited for morning. But I couldn't. Something in me needed to know. Slowly, I climbed. Step by step, my boots pressed into the aged wood, each footfall heavier than the last. The scent in the air grew stronger, the thick, cloying tang of iron clinging to my nostrils. Halfway up, my flashlight flickered. I froze. The light sputtered again, dimming for a fraction of a second before stabilizing. My grip tightened. It was just the batteries. I had extras back in the house. Then, from above, a sharp, deliberate knock. I stopped breathing. It had come from the lantern room. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart hammered against my ribs, the rhythmic thud of it drowning out everything else. I waited, listening, hoping I had imagined it. Then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, measured, like someone tapping against the glass. I forced myself to keep moving. Each step felt heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. My light wavered as I reached the top of the stairs, the beam stretching across the narrow space of the lantern room. It was empty. The broken glass still littered the floor, the beacon's rusted frame looming above me. My breath came fast, shallow, as I scanned every inch of the room. No one was here. But then, who knocked? The wind howled outside, rattling the fractured windows. The lighthouse groaned, the structure settling under the weight of time. I tried to convince myself that was it, that it was just the sound of the tower adjusting to the wind. But deep down, I knew better. Something was here, watching, waiting. I took a step toward the railing. The footprints from before were gone. The dust was undisturbed, as if no one had ever stood there, as if I had imagined it all. But I hadn't. I knew what I saw. I took a shaky breath and turned back toward the stairs. That was enough for tonight. I had work to do in the morning. I needed rest. I needed to think. As I stepped onto the top stair, the temperature plummeted. The warm air that had clung to the lighthouse all night vanished in an instant, replaced by an icy chill that sank into my bones. My breath curled in the air, a visible puff of mist hanging in front of me. And then, the door slammed shut. Hard, violent. The sound echoed through the tower, vibrating through the metal and stone. My flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming as I lunged forward, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. I twisted harder, my pulse racing, but the door refused to open. The cold deepened, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. My breath came fast, frantic, the air too thick, too heavy. Then, a whisper. Close. Right behind me. Low. Almost inhuman. I spun, my flashlight jerking wildly across the empty room. Nothing. The air settled, the cold retreating as quickly as it had come. My breath rasped in my throat as I slowly reached for the door handle again. This time, it turned. I stumbled out onto the staircase, slamming the door behind me. My flashlight was shaking in my hand as I practically ran down the steps, taking them two at a time. I didn't stop until I was back inside the keeper's house, locking the door behind me. My hands were still trembling as I dropped onto the wooden chair, trying to steady my breathing. The island was playing tricks on me. It had to be. The isolation, the darkness, the decay, it was getting inside my head, making me see things. That was all. I pulled out the old journal again, flipping to the last page. The final entry stared back at me, the ink smudged from time and wear. The light is out. I am not alone. The words felt heavier now, because I was starting to believe them. I don't know how long I sat in that chair, staring at the final entry in the old journal. The words blurred as exhaustion weighed on me, but my mind wouldn't quiet. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whisper again, felt the cold seep into my bones. I was not alone. The thought sat heavy in my chest, a dull pressure I couldn't shake. The island, the lighthouse, whatever was out there, it was watching, waiting. I needed to get out, but first I had to see it. Maybe it was madness, maybe it was desperation, but I needed to know what was inside that lighthouse. What had been knocking? What had been walking across those floors when I was the only one here? The storm outside had calmed, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The wind no longer howled, the waves no longer crashed as violently against the shore. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. I grabbed the flashlight in my bag, slipping the old journal inside. If something happened to me, someone needed to know. Someone needed to understand. I stepped outside. The lighthouse loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the murky sky. My breath came fast as I forced myself forward, each step heavier than the last. The door was already open. I hadn't left it that way. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of cold through me. The darkness inside the tower felt deeper, like it was swallowing the weak glow of my flashlight. I should have turned back, but I didn't. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the silence. The wind no longer seeped through the cracks. The old structure no longer groaned under its own weight. It was like the lighthouse itself was holding its breath. And then the smell hit me. It was stronger than before, thick, metallic, suffocating. My stomach turned as I covered my nose, but the scent clung to me, heavy and inescapable. I took a step forward, and the door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight jerking across the wooden walls. The door was shut, sealed as if it had never been opened. The handle wouldn't budge. Then, from above, footsteps. Not slow this time. Rushed, heavy, coming closer. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The sound wasn't human, too fast, too erratic, like someone running but dragging something behind them. And then, it stopped. Right above me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to lift the flashlight toward the staircase. The old wood stretched into the darkness, each step disappearing into the void above. I should have run, but my feet moved on their own. I started climbing. The air grew thicker with every step. It wasn't just the smell anymore. The atmosphere itself felt heavy, pressing against my skin like something unseen was watching. I gripped the railing tightly, my breath shallow. Halfway up, my flashlight flickered. And then I saw it. The footprints. Not like before. These were fresh, wet, smearing across the dust-covered floor, leading up. And then I heard it. A whisper, not behind me this time, right next to my ear. Low, ragged, hungry. Keep the light on. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as my body refused to move. The voice had been right there, so close I should have felt breath against my skin. But I was alone. I wasn't. Something moved in the darkness ahead. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, a presence shifting, lingering just out of reach of my light. My fingers tightened around the flashlight as I forced myself to take another step. Then another. Then I reached the top. The lantern room was wrong. The glass was shattered, the old beacon rusted and broken, just as I had seen before. But something was different. The air itself felt thicker, as if it had weight pressing against my chest. And the footprints, they ended in the center of the room. No body, no person, just footprints in the dust. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling as I swept it across the space. The light caught the railing, the rusted metal still streaked with whatever thick, dark substance I had seen before. And then I noticed it. The journal. My journal. It was open on the floor, flipped to the final page. The words stared back at me, smudged but unmistakable. The light is out. I am not alone. And then, as if responding to the words, the beacon flickered on. A blast of cold wind rushed through the room, knocking me back. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering against the floor as the light from the old beacon pulsed violently. The shadows shifted, and I saw it. A figure, tall, hollow, its body twisted in unnatural angles, its limbs too long, its head tilted as if trying to understand me. No face, no eyes, but I felt it staring. The cold intensified, sinking into my skin. My breath came in sharp gasps as I scrambled back, my hands scraping against the wooden planks. The figure moved, not walked, not stepped, shifted, closer. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My chest ached, the air too thick to breathe. The light flickered again, and for a split second, the figure was right in front of me. Its presence pressed against me, unseen hands grasping, reaching. And then, the beacon died. The room was plunged into darkness. A whisper, one final breath against my ear. Keep the light on. Then, the door slammed open. The force knocked me backward, sending me sprawling onto the top step. I gasped as the freezing air vanished, replaced by the warm, stale scent of dust and rust. I scrambled to my feet, my body shaking. The room was empty. The footprints were gone. The beacon off. And yet, the words in my journal had changed. One sentence. It won't let you leave. My pulse hammered as I grabbed the book, my fingers shaking. I didn't care what was real anymore. I didn't care if it was all in my head. I needed to get out. I don't remember how I got down the stairs. One moment, I was standing in the lantern room, my hands gripping that cursed journal, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. The next, I was running. My body moved on instinct, my legs barely keeping up as I stumbled down the spiral staircase. Each step creaked beneath me, and for a terrifying moment, I thought the old wood would give way, sending me crashing into the darkness below. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like unseen hands trying to hold me back. My chest ached, my lungs burned, but the only thing that mattered was getting out. Then, a thump behind me. I froze. Not footsteps. Something heavier. A weight shifting above me, as if something had just stepped onto the landing. I didn't look back. I forced myself forward, gripping the rusted railings so tightly that flakes of metal bit into my palm. The walls around me groaned, the lighthouse seeming to breathe in the dark. The air carried a familiar scent now, one that I had been trying to ignore for days. What? I choked back a sob as I reached the final step, nearly throwing myself at the door. My fingers scrambled at the latch, the old metal refusing to budge. Behind me, another thump, closer this time. I slammed my fist against the door. Come on, come on. A whisper brushed my ear. The light is out. My vision blurred. My hands fumbled, sweat slicking my grip. And then the door flew open. I fell forward, crashing onto the wet, rocky ground outside. The air hit me like a wave, warm and humid, nothing like the frigid, suffocating cold inside the lighthouse. The moment I landed, I turned onto my back. The door was shut, not swinging closed, not creaking on its hinges, just shut. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The lighthouse stood silent, towering over me, its beacon dead. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy mist that curled around the rocks. I sat there, trembling, my hands still clutching the old journal against my chest. Was it over? The thought barely had time to settle before I noticed something. The footprints leading to the lighthouse were gone. The ones I had made, the ones I knew had been there. It was as if I had never walked up to that door, as if I had never been inside. I swallowed hard, my throat raw. My fingers dug into the dirt, grounding myself, trying to convince myself that I was real, that I had actually experienced what just happened. And then, the lighthouse's door creaked. Not fully open, just a fraction, just enough for me to see. There was something inside, a shadow, a presence standing at the base of the stairs, watching, waiting. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. By the time I reached my cabin, the sky had started to lighten. The horizon was tinged with the first hints of dawn, but the warmth of the rising sun did nothing to ease the chill in my bones. I locked the door behind me, my fingers still shaking. My breath came in short, uneven bursts as I leaned against the wooden frame, my mind racing. Had I lost my mind? Had I really seen what I thought I saw? I forced myself to sit at the small table, the old journal still clutched in my hands. The pages were damp, smudged with sweat and dirt. I flipped through them again, my heart pounding as I returned to that last page. It won't let you leave. I stared at the words. And then, right in front of my eyes, the ink shifted. It was faint at first, like the words were being erased by an unseen hand. And then, slowly, carefully, new words appeared. You brought it back. My stomach twisted. My vision blurred. I shoved the book away, my chair scraping against the floor as I stood up too fast. My whole body felt wrong, like my skin didn't fit anymore. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I don't remember sleeping that night. I must have, at some point, because the next thing I knew, the sun was fully up, streaming through the windows. Everything looked normal. The lighthouse still stood in the distance, its silhouette unmoving against the morning sky. The waves rolled in gently, the island eerily quiet. Like nothing had happened. Like I had imagined it all. But then, I saw the footprints. Not leading to the lighthouse. Leading away from it. Straight to my cabin. The dirt outside my door was disturbed, the imprint of heavy steps leading directly to where I stood. My breath hitched. My hands went ice cold. I slowly backed away from the door. And then, from inside my cabin, a single knock on the wall. I wasn't alone. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. That knock, soft, deliberate, it came from inside my cabin. My stomach churned, my pulse hammering in my ears. I pressed my back against the opposite wall, every muscle in my body tense. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, the air itself feeling too heavy to breathe. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting. Minutes? Hours? It felt like an eternity. The knock didn't come again. No movement, no whispers. Just the low hum of the wind outside and the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. I told myself that if I just stood still, if I didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would go away. But something had changed. The air inside my cabin felt different. It wasn't just heavy. It was occupied. Like something unseen was sharing the space with me. Watching. Waiting. Morning came, but the fear didn't leave. I forced myself to go outside. I needed to know if the footprints were still there. And they were. But now, there were more. Not just leading to my door, circling the cabin. They weren't my prints. The ground was uneven, disturbed, like something had been pacing all night. I felt sick. I should have left right then and there. Packed my things, found a way off that island. But a part of me, a stupid, reckless part, needed to see something first. The lighthouse. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that it was real, that what had happened the night before hadn't been some sleep-deprived hallucination. Or maybe it was calling me back. The walk felt longer than usual. Every step forward felt like a mistake. By the time I reached the lighthouse, the wind had picked up, cold and sharp against my face. The door stood slightly open, just like it had been the night before. Waiting. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, thick, pungent, like salt and something rotting beneath it. The air was damp. The wood beneath my feet slick with moisture. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to run while I still had the chance. But then, I saw the lantern room. The light was back on. I knew I hadn't lit it. My breath caught. My pulse thundered. But it wasn't just the light. There was a shadow standing in front of it. Not moving. Not shifting. Just standing there. Waiting. And then, the figure turned. I don't remember leaving. I must have run, but the next thing I knew, I was back in my cabin, locking the door behind me. I packed whatever I could. Clothes, my wallet, my keys. The journal? I left it behind. I didn't care. I just needed to get off the island. I radioed the mainland, my voice shaking as I demanded, not asked, to be picked up. The ferry arrived that evening. The man steering it barely said a word as I stepped on board. He just glanced at me, then at the lighthouse, before muttering something under his breath. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I didn't want to know. I never went back. Not to the island. Not to the lighthouse. And yet, it never really left me. Even now, I still see it. Not in my dreams. Not in the corners of my vision. But in reflections. Windows. Mirrors. Even the glass of my phone screen. A tall, shadowed figure standing near a distant light. It all started back in 2007 when I was a young nurse, just beginning my career in the medical field. I was eager to help people, and the thought of working in a hospital thrilled me. Little did I know, I would find myself in a place that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. This hospital was old, crumbling in parts, but it had that charm that only buildings with years of history could have. The kind of charm that made you feel like the walls were whispering secrets, if only you were quiet enough to listen. I was assigned to the night shift, which wasn't unusual for a new nurse. The night shifts were always quieter, giving me a chance to get comfortable with my duties without the overwhelming bustle of the day staff. But on the night shift, there was a different kind of silence, a thick, almost oppressive quiet. It wasn't the peace of a quiet hospital, but something else, something uneasy. The hospital, built in the 1920s, had seen a lot of patients come and go. It had served as a place of healing, but also, over the years, had been a place where countless souls had passed. The corridors, lined with old tile floors, cracked in places, had seen many generations of medical staff walk through them, some who were still there, some who had long since retired. My colleagues and I would often joke about how the building was haunted, but I quickly learned that there was more truth to those jokes than I could have ever imagined. The staff was a mix of veterans and rookies. The veterans were seasoned, calm, and almost too familiar with the strange events that seemed to occur on occasion. They would shake their heads when new nurses would ask them about the weird noises or cold spots in certain rooms, as if they were well acquainted with the hospital's quirks. The rookies, like me, were just getting their bearings and trying to keep our nerves steady. One of the things that always stood out to me was how often patients would ask me about the other people they saw at night. "Who's that standing in the corner of my room?" they'd ask, their voices shaky and confused. I would always chalk it up to medication or their minds playing tricks in the quiet of the night, but there was always something unsettling about the way they spoke. There were no other people in those rooms, at least none that I could see. It was my first few weeks on the job when I met Oliver, a senior nurse who had worked in the hospital for decades. He was one of the veterans, a no-nonsense guy who was easy to talk to once you got past his gruff exterior. I learned a lot from him, but he had one piece of advice that stuck with me. "Trust your instincts, kid," he said to me one night, his voice low as we walked down the long hallway towards the Immerse. "This place, it's got a soul of its own. And if you don't respect it, well, it'll make sure you do." At the time, I didn't know what he meant, but his words lingered in my mind. I figured he was just being cryptic, the way old nurses tend to be. But as time went on, I began to notice things, little things that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Strange sounds in the middle of the night, flickering lights, doors that seemed to open on their own. These were things that I could easily explain away, things that seemed like just part of working in an old building. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, I began to realize that something wasn't right. There was a room on the third floor, room 314, that always felt different. Every time I had to go in there, it felt as though the air grew heavier, the shadows seemed to stretch longer. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Other nurses and even the doctors would avoid it if they could. There was no particular reason for it, at least none that anyone could explain, but there was just something off about it. Something wrong. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. But one night, when I was assigned to work on the third floor, I was forced to go into room 314 to check on a patient who had been admitted after a car accident. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The temperature dropped. My breath became visible in front of me, despite it being a warm night outside. The lights flickered above, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the corner of the room, just a shadow, but it was enough to make my heart race. I wasn't sure if it was my nerves getting the best of me or something more sinister, but I quickly checked on the patient and left the room. As I walked back down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was then that I began to understand what Oliver had meant. This place had a presence, and it was watching. It was late one evening when I first truly experienced the hospital's unnerving atmosphere. It'd been on the night shift for a few weeks by then, and had already started to notice odd little things, nothing overtly alarming, but enough to make me feel uncomfortable. But that night, it was as if the hospital had decided to let me in on its secret. The shift started like any other. I arrived at the hospital around 7 p.m., greeted by the usual buzz of nurses and doctors preparing for the night ahead. The night shift was always quieter than the day, but there was still the steady hum of activity as patients were settled in for the evening. Medical charts were updated, and staff made their rounds. I had already gotten into the rhythm of it all, the motions becoming second nature as I moved from room to room, checking on patients, administering medications, and answering calls from the nurses' station. But then, around midnight, things began to change. I had just finished checking on a patient in room 207 and was heading down the hallway when I noticed something strange. The lights, always flickering at night, were dimming more than usual. It wasn't a smooth flicker, like the lights were struggling to stay on. It was more like someone was turning them down, as though the power was being slowly drained from the building. I glanced up, half expecting to see the telltale sign of a faulty bulb, but nothing seemed out of place. The lights were intact, but they were growing weaker, like the hospital itself was trying to keep me in the dark. I walked down the hall towards the nurse's station, but something caught my eye. At the end of the corridor, I saw a figure, just a silhouette, standing at the far end, almost hidden in the shadows. It was a woman, I thought, though it was hard to be sure. She was standing still, facing the wall, motionless. I paused for a moment, squinting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. The building was quiet, too quiet for someone to be standing there without a reason. But then, just as I was about to take a step forward, the figure seemed to turn and disappear down a side hallway, vanishing into the darkness. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Had I just seen someone, or was it my mind playing tricks on me? It had been a long shift after all. I shook my head, dismissing it as exhaustion. Maybe I had just seen a shadow, or perhaps one of the other nurses had walked by without me noticing. Still, something felt off. I continued walking toward the nurse's station, where Oliver was seated behind the desk, updating patient records. He looked up as I approached, his usual calm demeanor still intact. I didn't mention the figure to him right away. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but there was something about that hallway, about the way the lights dimmed and the figure disappeared, that kept nagging at me. "You okay?" Oliver asked, noticing the hesitation in my steps. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "Just a little tired," I said, trying to brush it off. "The lights were acting funny, that's all." Oliver grunted, setting down his pen. He looked at me with a knowing expression. "The lights, huh? They do that sometimes. The building's old, you know. It's bound to have some quirks." I didn't say anything. It wasn't just the lights. It was the feeling in the air, the strange presence that seemed to be hanging over the hospital, like it was alive. But I didn't want to sound like I was overreacting, so I kept quiet. As the night wore on, I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to that figure I'd seen at the end of the hallway. Was it a patient? A nurse? Or something else entirely? Every time I tried to push the thought away, it crept back into my mind, tugging at me like a memory I couldn't fully grasp. It was around 3 a.m. when I had to make my rounds on the 3rd floor again. Room 314 was on that floor, and it had been a few days since it last had to go in there. I tried not to think about it as I took the elevator up to the top floor, but the moment the doors opened, I felt that familiar chill wash over me. The hallways on the 3rd floor were even quieter than the rest of the hospital, if that was even possible. It was as if the floor itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I walked slowly down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I reached room 314, I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the door handle. The temperature seemed to drop even more the closer I got to the room. My breath formed small clouds in the air as I opened the door. Inside, the patient, a middle-aged man who had been in a car accident, was asleep, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but something about the room felt wrong. It wasn't just the coldness. It was as if the air itself was thick with something, like the room was holding on to something that didn't belong. I checked his vitals quickly, trying to keep my mind focused on the task at hand. But then, as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. On the floor, near the bed, there was a small piece of paper. It was crumpled, like it had been thrown there in a hurry. I bent down to pick it up, wondering how it had gotten there. The patient was unconscious, and there was no one else in the room. When I unfolded the paper, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. It was a drawing, a crude, childlike drawing of a figure standing at the end of a hallway. The figure was a shadowy silhouette, just like the one I had seen earlier. The drawing wasn't much, just a simple sketch, but the fact that it had been left in the room was unsettling. I looked around the room, but there was no explanation for the drawing. No patient, no nurse, no one could have left it there. It didn't make sense. My mind was racing as I left the room and made my way back down the hall. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trying to get my attention. I had no idea what was going on, but I had a feeling that this was only the beginning. As I passed the nurse's station, I saw Oliver again, sitting at the desk, his face illuminated by the glow of his computer screen. I didn't say anything about the drawing or the figure I had seen earlier. Instead, I kept my thoughts to myself, unsure of how to process what was happening. But just as I was about to head back to the break room, I heard Oliver mutter something under his breath, almost as if he were talking to himself. I thought I saw something. I stopped in my tracks, looking at him. What? Oliver didn't look up from his computer, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Nothing. Just. Never mind. But it was clear to me now. Oliver knew something I didn't. He wasn't just an old nurse with superstitions. He had seen it too. The strange occurrences that night marked the beginning of something far darker. The subtle signs, the flickering lights, the figure in the hallway, the drawing in room 314 were only the first whispers of the hospital's true nature. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer in a place of healing. I had entered a place where the past was very much alive, and it wasn't finished with us yet. Now, with that unsettling incident behind us, the strange events would only grow more frequent. And the more I tried to push them away, the more the hospital's dark history seemed to demand my attention. The true horror was just beginning, and I was beginning to realize that there was no escaping it. As the days dragged on, the hospital's sinister presence grew more pronounced. It wasn't just one strange event anymore, it was constant. The lights flickered at unpredictable intervals, and the temperature in certain rooms dropped suddenly, even on warm nights. Every time I walked down a corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was a creeping sensation, like a chill crawling up the back of my neck, a silent pressure that tightened around my chest. But what bothered me more than anything was the silence. The kind of silence that wasn't natural, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I'd never been one to believe in ghosts or supernatural occurrences, but the strange events were stacking up too high to ignore. The figure I had seen at the end of the hallway had not been a trick of the light, and the drawing in room 314 couldn't be explained away as some random accident. It felt deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with me. That's when the sound started. At first, it was just a low hum in the background, barely noticeable, almost like the faint murmur of voices. But as the days went on, the hum grew louder. It wasn't in any one area, it was everywhere. It sounded like whispers, but they were too faint to understand, as if they were being muffled by something just out of reach. The whispering grew louder when I was alone in the empty hallways, and the low hum would follow me from room to room. It was unsettling, like I was being stalked by something invisible. I tried to ignore it, tried to chalk it up to the building's age or the natural creaks and groans that come with an old structure. But when it happened again, right in front of me, I knew I could no longer dismiss it. It was a Friday night, and the hospital was quieter than usual. The night shifts were less busy, the patients settled in for the evening, and the staff was working in their usual routine. I had just finished checking on the rooms on the second floor and was heading back to the nurse's station when it happened. I was walking down the hall near room 208 when I heard it, a soft, barely perceptible sound that made my blood run cold. It was a scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. At first, I thought it was just another one of those unsettling sounds the building liked to make, but it was too distinct, too deliberate to ignore. My heart skipped a beat as I froze in place, staring down the hallway. The scraping sound continued, slow and methodical, and it was coming from the storage closet at the end of the corridor. I knew no one was supposed to be in there. The storage closet was always locked unless a nurse or staff member needed to get supplies. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was just a janitor's cart or something else easily explained. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The noise was too eerie, too unsettling. My hands trembled as I made my way down the hall, each step louder than the last. As I approached the closet, the noise stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick in the air like a heavy fog. My mind raced, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I just stood there for a moment, waiting for something to happen, wondering if I was imagining things. But nothing did. The hallway remained empty, as quiet as ever. I walked past the closet, glancing over my shoulder just to make sure. But that's when I saw it, just for a split second, through the small window in the closet door. I saw movement. A shadow shifting slowly inside, as if someone or something was watching me. I didn't waste any time. My heart pounding in my chest, I hurried back to the nurse's station. Oliver was sitting at his usual spot, tapping away on his keyboard. He didn't look up as I approached, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. "Oliver," I said, my voice low and shaky. "I just heard something." From the storage closet. He finally looked up, his face unreadable. "What kind of something?" I hesitated, unsure of how to explain it. "I don't know." It was like something scraping across the floor, and then when I went to check it out, it stopped. But I could see something moving inside, through the window. Oliver didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at me, his eyes hard, like he was weighing whether to tell me something. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You're not the first one to hear it," he said, his voice quiet. "There've been others. People hear things, see things. It's part of the building's history." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean? What history?" He looked around the room as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "You've probably heard the stories. This place wasn't always a hospital. Before it was a medical facility, it was a mental institution. Back then, they didn't care too much about the patients. They did things. Terrible things." My mind raced as I processed what he was saying. It made sense, in a way. The hospital had always felt old, but there was something about it that made it feel like it had been built on suffering. It had that weight to it, that darkness that never seemed to go away. "There's a room," Oliver continued, "on the 4th floor. They say it's special. They don't use it anymore, but sometimes, when the building gets too quiet, the things that were done there, they come back." I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear more, but I couldn't help myself. "What happened in that room?" He shook his head. "It's not something you should get involved with. Just leave it be." But I couldn't leave it be. I couldn't ignore the feeling that the hospital was alive in some way, that it was pushing back against the living, trying to make us feel its pain. Something was happening, and I needed to know what. That night, after my shift ended, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the whispers, the scraping sounds echoing in my mind. I knew I had to go back. I had to see the 4th floor for myself. But before I could act on it, another incident took place that shook me to my core. It was 4 a.m. when I was walking down the main hallway on the 1st floor. Everything seemed normal, too normal, in fact. But then I saw a door that had always been closed, always locked, was ajar. It was the door to the old morgue, a place that had been sealed off for years. I hadn't been near that room since it started working there, but seeing the door open sent a cold shiver down my spine. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the faintest scent of decay hit me. It wasn't overpowering, but it was enough to make my stomach turn. The room was empty, but it felt wrong. The air was thick, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. But then I noticed something on the floor, a small, blood-stained piece of cloth tucked under the door. I bent down to pick it up, my hand shaking. As I unfolded it, I realized it wasn't just any cloth. It was a surgical gown, stained dark red. The sight of it made my stomach lurch, but that wasn't what disturbed me the most. It was the initials sewn into the fabric, initials that I recognized. I stumbled back, gasping for air. I knew those initials. They were mine. The walls of the hospital were closing in, and the more I tried to understand what was happening, the more tangled the mystery became. The strange events were no longer isolated incidents. They were connected, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew that something dark, something ancient, was awakening in the hospital. The night air in the hospital was thick with tension, as if the building itself was waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn toward the truth, like a moth to a flame. It was almost too much to bear. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had uncovered so far, and the strange occurrences that continued to escalate. The hospital was becoming a nightmare, and I was its unwilling guest. I had heard whispers, seen shadows, and experienced things I couldn't explain. But now it was time to face whatever had been lurking in the dark corners of this place. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The story Oliver had hinted at, the history of the building, the room on the 4th floor, the things that had happened there, it had been gnawing at me. Every new discovery had only deepened the mystery, and I knew the only way to end this torment was to confront it head-on. I had to go to the 4th floor. The night shift was uneventful, and I found myself alone once again. The clock in the hallway ticked loudly, almost mocking me with its constant reminder of time. The corridor seemed endless, stretching before me like a maze. I moved cautiously, the floor beneath my feet creaking with each step. The whispers were louder now, always just out of reach, like a language I couldn't understand, but one that made my skin crawl every time they rose in volume. They seemed to follow me, echoing in the empty halls. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the 4th floor. The building groaned as the elevator rose, the hum of the machinery filling the silence. My heart pounded in my chest as the doors opened with a soft ding. The 4th floor was darker than the rest of the hospital, almost as if it were sealed off from the world. I stood at the entrance, staring into the corridor ahead, where the dim, flickering lights barely illuminated the way. I took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness, my footsteps echoing through the quiet hall. The air felt colder here, the temperature dropping with every step I took. I moved cautiously, my senses on high alert, aware of every creak of the building and every shadow that moved just outside the corners of my vision. I had no idea what to expect, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me that I was about to find out. As I walked down the hall, I came across a room 407. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint light flickering from within. Something compelled me to enter. It was the same feeling that had drawn me to this hospital in the first place, a force beyond my understanding. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges squeaking in protest, and stepped inside. The room was cold, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. The walls were lined with old cracked mirrors, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. But in the center of the room was a large, rusted gurney, its wheels squeaking as if it hadn't been moved in decades. And on the floor beside it, there was someone, sitting motionless. I froze, my blood running cold. The figure on the floor was cloaked in shadows, but I could see its outline clearly. It was a woman, her back hunched, her hands resting on the floor in front of her. Her hair hung loosely around her face, hiding her features, but I could feel her eyes on me. Her presence was overwhelming, like a force I couldn't escape. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The woman didn't move, but I felt her response before I heard it, like an invisible force pushing against me. filling the room with a suffocating energy. The air became heavier, and the temperature dropped even further, sending chills down my spine. Then, without warning, she lifted her head, and I gasped. Her face was a horror, twisted and grotesque, as if it had been frozen in a moment of agony. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, empty pits that seemed to draw me in. Her mouth opened slowly, and I heard her speak, her voice cold and hollow, as if it came from the depths of the earth itself. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. "It's too late for you." I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker, thicker. I could hear the whispers now, louder than ever, coming from all directions, circling me like a swarm of unseen creatures. They were no longer just whispers. They were words, strange and foreign, like an ancient language. And in the midst of them, I heard something else, a low, guttural growl, like the growl of an animal, only far deeper, far more unnatural. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to flee, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping me inside. I turned back to the woman, my mind racing for any explanation, any way out. But she was gone. The room was empty now, but the oppressive presence lingered, thick and suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest, my breathing erratic. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the shadows creeping closer, tightening their grip. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it. In the reflection of one of the cracked mirrors, I saw myself. But it wasn't just me. Standing behind me, in the dim light, was a figure, tall, shadowy, and impossibly still. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. I knew that if I did, I would never be able to escape whatever was standing there. The whispers grew louder, the growls growing more distinct, more urgent. And then I heard her voice again, but this time it was different. It was more than a whisper. It was a scream echoing in my mind, as if the very building was alive, screaming out its pain. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice screamed. "You're a part of it now. You can't leave." My chest tightened and panic set in. I tried the door again, pulling at the handle with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. And then, suddenly, the shadows that had been creeping closer to me reached out, their tendrils wrapping around my limbs, pulling me toward the gurney in the center of the room. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the woman's face, her hollow eyes staring into mine. And then, nothing. As I struggled to sit up, I realized I wasn't in the same room I had fallen unconscious in. The walls were different, the air colder. The faint hum of machinery was gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. I was in another part of the hospital, one I didn't recognize. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. It felt wrong, like everything in this place was warped, out of time and space. I needed to leave. No matter what happened, I couldn't stay in this hellhole any longer. I had seen enough to know that there was something here, something that didn't belong. The idea of going back to the hospital floor where it all started filled me with dread, but it was my only option. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't leave, if I didn't escape whatever grip the hospital had on me, I would never get out. It wasn't just about my safety anymore. It was about survival, about reclaiming my life from the curse that had ensnared me. But as I stood up, the weight of the place seemed to grow heavier. The walls were closing in again, and the whispers that had been absent for a while began to seep back into my ears. I tried to push them away, but it was useless. The air grew dense, thick with an oppressive energy that made it difficult to breathe. I forced myself to move, to walk down the hallway, but each step felt like I was trudging through molasses. My legs were shaky, my body weak, but I had no choice. I had to escape. The hospital's layout seemed to twist before me. Hallways I had walked down earlier now looked unfamiliar, as though the very structure of the building was changing. The floors creaked beneath my feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart raced as I turned a corner and came face to face with the same dark hallway I had entered when I first came to the fourth floor. I froze. This was it, the final stretch, the end of the line, the place I had been trying to avoid, but now it was inevitable. I took a deep breath and pushed forward. I couldn't let fear control me anymore. It was either leave or be consumed by whatever haunted this place. But as I walked, I began to see things, glimpses of figures out of the corner of my eye. They were everywhere, lurking in the shadows, watching me with their hollow eyes. There were no words this time, no growls, no whispers, just the cold, unblinking stares of the things that haunted this place. They didn't move, they didn't approach me, but their presence was suffocating. It was like being in a room full of invisible hands, all pressing in on me, trying to suffocate me with the weight of their attention. And then I saw her again. The woman from room 407. She was standing at the end of the hall, her face still twisted and contorted in that grotesque expression. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel the terror rising in my chest. I couldn't stop myself from moving, even though my body screamed for me to run in the other direction. I had no choice. But this time, something was different. There was no growl, no screeching voice. She just stood there, silent, her gaze unblinking. The air around her shimmered with a strange, unnatural energy. I could feel it, the power she radiated, as if the very walls of the hospital were alive with her presence. I stopped, unsure of what to do. The hospital felt different now, as though everything I had experienced up until this point had been leading to this moment. I was no longer in control of the situation. It wasn't just a haunted hospital anymore. This was something far darker, something beyond comprehension, and I had been brought here to bear witness to it. But as I stood frozen in place, I realized something. There was a choice. I didn't have to stay. I didn't have to let her, or whatever was controlling this place, have any more of my life. I could leave, and I would. With everything I had left, I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop to question the flickering lights or the whispers that tried to draw me in. I just ran. The hallways blurred around me, but I could still hear her voice in my mind. "You can't leave," she had said before. But I wasn't listening anymore. I had made up my mind. I reached the elevator, and without thinking, I slammed my hand against the button. The doors opened with a soft ping, and I rushed inside. The moment the doors shut, the weight in the air seemed to lift, and the oppressive darkness that had surrounded me in the hallways faded into a distant memory. I didn't know if it was over, if the hospital had finally released its grip on me, but I was done. I wasn't going to let whatever had happened here control me anymore. The elevator descended, the sound of the machinery a welcome relief compared to the silence of the floors above. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into the lobby, and I didn't stop. I didn't even look around. I kept walking out through the main entrance into the cool night air. I made it. I had escaped. But even as I stepped outside, the unease didn't leave me. The feeling that I wasn't truly free because I knew something else now. That hospital wasn't just a building. It was a place that had seen things, done things that were beyond understanding. And even though I had escaped, I couldn't forget the eyes of those trapped within. They would haunt me forever. Weeks passed, but I couldn't shake the memories. The shadows, the whispers, the woman in room 407. I tried to move on, tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Every time I walked down a dimly lit hallway, I could feel the weight of something watching me. I tried to reach out to Oliver. Maybe he had answers. Maybe he knew how to make sense of it all. But when I finally contacted him, he never replied. The hospital was no longer listed in the directory, and the address was completely removed from the maps, as if it had never existed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized what I had experienced wasn't just some haunted building. It was something else entirely, something that couldn't be explained. It was as if the hospital had been a doorway, a threshold to something darker, something that had been waiting for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital was still out there, waiting for me, no matter how far I ran. Every shadow seemed to carry a piece of it with me. Every quiet moment echoed the oppressive silence of those dark hallways. I had left the physical place behind, but the memories, the nightmares, clung to me like an unshakable fog. I had escaped, but had I really? I tried to live my life as best as I could. The days blurred together, the world outside moving as though nothing had changed. Friends reached out asking if I was okay, if I was getting back to normal, but how could I? How could anyone? I had seen things, felt things that no one should ever experience. And the worst part, I couldn't explain it. I couldn't even begin to make sense of it, no matter how hard I tried. I thought of Oliver often. He had vanished, almost as if he had been swallowed by the same darkness that had consumed the hospital. I checked his social media, hoping for some sign of life, but there was nothing. No posts, no messages. It was like he had been erased, like the entire world had decided to forget about him. And that thought, the idea that people could just disappear without a trace, lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. Had I truly left the hospital behind, or had I simply been marked, a part of something that couldn't be undone? Sometimes, when I walked down the street or stood at the edge of a crowd, I would feel the weight of invisible eyes watching me. The shadows that once filled the hallways of that forsaken hospital were now following me. I could feel their presence, just beyond my line of sight, lurking in the corners of my vision. There were days when I was sure I heard the faintest whisper, the softest echo of the voices I had heard in the hospital, like they were trying to reach me, to draw me back. I told myself it was all in my head, that I had been traumatized, that the fear and the stress of those days had twisted my perception of reality. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that the hospital wasn't just a place. It was an entity, something that had a life of its own, something that had touched me in ways I would never fully understand. And I could feel it still, like a cold hand pressed against the back of my neck. The nightmares didn't stop either. At night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, breath shallow. In those dreams, I was always back in the hospital. Sometimes I was walking down the same dim hallways, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. Other times, I was locked in a room with no windows, trapped, waiting for the woman from room 407 to appear again. I never saw her face in the dreams, but I could feel her presence, her eyes on me, watching, waiting for something, anything, to happen. One night, I woke up, my mind still foggy from the dream, and I noticed something strange. I was no longer in my bed. I was sitting upright, my hands clutching the sheets tightly, and my heart was racing, the same fear I had felt in the hospital creeping back into my chest. I looked around the room, but everything seemed normal, except for one thing. On the nightstand next to my bed, there was a small piece of paper. It was folded, its edges frayed, as though it had been carried a long way before it ended up here, in my bedroom. I slowly reached out and unfolded it, my hands trembling. The handwriting was scrawled in uneven, hurried strokes, the ink blotchy in places, as though the writer had been shaking. The note read, "It's not over. We never let go." I froze. I couldn't breathe. The words seemed to pierce the silence of my room like a knife, cutting through the illusion of normalcy that had surrounded me for weeks. I didn't know how to respond, how to even comprehend what I was seeing. My mind raced, but the only thought that I could hold on to was this: I wasn't safe. The room around me seemed to grow colder, the air thick with something I couldn't quite name. I looked at the walls, the shadows creeping along the edges, and I knew, without a doubt, that the hospital was still with me. It wasn't a place I could leave, not truly. It had found a way into my life, into my very being, and no matter how far I ran, it would always be a part of me. I shoved the note into the drawer, trying to push it out of my mind, but I couldn't. I knew it was pointless. I could move to another city, change my name, do everything I could to escape, but the hospital had already marked me. It had already attached itself to my soul, and nothing would ever erase that. Days turned into weeks again, and I began to wonder if this would ever stop. The whispers, the cold presence, the feeling of being watched. Would they ever let go? Or had I truly crossed a threshold from which there was no return? The thought of living with this unshakable weight, this creeping fear, gnawed at me. One day, I gathered the strength to reach out to the one person who might understand what I was going through. I found an old friend, someone who had always been a bit of a skeptic, but I knew she had a strong sense of reality, grounded in facts and reason. I poured my heart out to her, told her everything I had experienced, every detail, every nightmare. I told her about the hospital, about Oliver, and about the eerie note I had found in my room. She listened in silence, her eyes wide with disbelief, but after a long pause, she said something that chilled me to my core. "You're not the first person to experience something like this. There are others, people who have felt it too, people who have been marked by that place." I asked her what she meant, but she didn't answer. She just stared at me, her face pale, as though she was afraid of what she might say next. I didn't know what to make of her words, but deep down, I realized I had been right. The hospital, the terror, the nightmares, they weren't just mine. They were part of something far bigger, something more sinister that was beyond my understanding. It had been a tough few months. Work was demanding, and personal life was a roller coaster. So when I saw the ad for the Grandview, nestled in a quiet part of the country, surrounded by hills and woods, with an old-world charm, I thought it would be the perfect retreat. The hotel itself was massive, the kind of place you don't come across every day. It had that vintage, almost forgotten charm to it, with dark wood floors that creaked beneath your feet and chandeliers that glowed dimly, adding to the hotel's mysterious aura. From the moment I stepped inside, it felt like I had entered a different time, like it was stuck in the past, somewhere between the 1920s and 1950s. When I checked in, the receptionist, a middle-aged man with a tired yet kind face, greeted me with a warm smile. He didn't seem like he wanted to be there, but he was polite enough. He handed me an old brass key, the kind you don't see much anymore. There was something almost charming about it, though it did strike me as odd. He explained the hotel had only a few guests at the moment, so it would be quiet, which I was relieved to hear. The room they assigned me was on the third floor, a long hallway with thick carpet that muffled the sound of my footsteps. I was alone in the hotel, and yet the silence felt heavy. The walls were adorned with faded paintings and old photographs of the hotel in its prime. The air had a peculiar scent, like a mixture of dust and something old, but not unpleasant. Just old. As I entered the room, I couldn't help but notice how everything seemed carefully preserved. The bed had a vintage quilt, the furniture was made of dark wood, and the windows offered a breathtaking view of the surrounding countryside. It was exactly what I had been hoping for, a place to relax and forget about the outside world. The first day passed in perfect normalcy. I had a long walk around the grounds, took in the fresh air, and spent hours reading on the hotel's front porch. Everything felt fine, peaceful, even. The hotel was quiet, as the receptionist had promised, with only a handful of guests here and there. I never once felt uncomfortable or uneasy. The next morning, I decided to take a longer walk through the nearby woods. The hotel was located on a large property, with winding trails that led deep into the trees. I felt like I had the whole place to myself. After a few hours of walking, I returned to the hotel feeling refreshed, but something about the place started to feel a little different. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I thought it was just my imagination. Later that evening, I decided to grab dinner in the hotel's dining room. The restaurant had the same old-fashioned charm as the rest of the place, dimly lit with thick curtains and heavy silverware. As I sat at my table, I noticed that there were only 2 other guests dining. I greeted them with a nod, but they didn't respond. They were just staring into their food, not saying a word. I figured they were just tired and left it at that. As I finished my meal, I looked up and caught a glimpse of the reflection of the dining room in the mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something move in the background, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. I convinced myself it was just the light playing tricks on my eyes. That night, as I retired to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had started to settle in. The stillness of the hotel seemed a little too thick now, like the air had become heavier. I tried to brush it off as exhaustion, but it was when I lay in bed that I realized something strange. The sounds of the hotel, the usual creaks and groans, had started to change. It wasn't the normal settling of an old building. It sounded almost deliberate. I shrugged it off and closed my eyes, trying to sleep. But that night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I drifted off, I was awoken by some unfamiliar noise. A knock at the door, the sound of footsteps outside my room, a low thud from above. I lay in the darkness, my eyes wide open, wondering if I had made a mistake in choosing this hotel. The next morning, I woke up with a lingering sense of unease. I had barely slept the night before, but I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. It was, after all, a large, old hotel, and sounds traveled through walls. Old buildings had a way of creaking and groaning at night, especially when the weather changed. I shook off the lingering feeling of dread and decided to go down to the lobby for breakfast, hoping that a good meal would set the tone for the day and help me shake the oddness of the night before. As I stepped into the hotel's dining area, the thick air felt almost heavier than usual. The room was filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries, but the usual warmth of a breakfast crowd was absent. The room was empty save for one man sitting in the corner, his back to me. He looked as though he had been sitting there for hours, lost in his own thoughts. I greeted the waitress, a young woman who seemed to have trouble making eye contact. She was polite but distant, her movements mechanical. She led me to a table by the window, and as I sat down, I couldn't help but notice the odd silence that enveloped the room. It wasn't just the absence of people, it was as though the silence was too deep, too thick. As I looked out the window, I caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of the forest that bordered the hotel's grounds. The figure was distant, almost a shadow, but I could make out the vague outline of a person. They stood still, staring at the hotel as if they were waiting for something or someone. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I quickly dismissed it. It was probably just another guest, someone out for a morning walk, or perhaps the hotel's caretaker. I told myself that it was nothing. Breakfast passed uneventfully, but something about the hotel seemed to have changed overnight. The stillness from the previous night lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. As I finished my meal and prepared to leave, the waitress brought me the check. Her face was pale, and she didn't smile once. When I handed her the money, I noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she took the bill from me. I left the dining room and walked back to my room, but as I passed the hallway that led to the stairwell, I couldn't help but notice something strange. The air felt colder. The temperature had dropped, but it wasn't just that. It felt like there was something else in the air. Something watching me. I quickly made my way back to my room and locked the door behind me. I decided that maybe I needed a nap to rest my mind and recharge for the rest of the day. I lay down on the bed, closed my eyes, and drifted into a light sleep. It was then that I heard it, the first sound that would forever stay etched in my memory. A soft knock at the door. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but when the knock came again, I jumped up from the bed, my heart racing. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't called for room service, and the only other guests in the hotel seemed to keep to themselves, just like I had. I hesitated for a moment before I slowly approached the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening carefully. Nothing. There was no one on the other side. I turned the knob and opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway was empty. No one in sight. I stepped out into the hallway, scanning both directions, but all I saw was the dimly lit corridor stretching before me. No sounds, no movement, just the thick, unnerving silence. I felt a sudden chill on the back of my neck, as if someone or something was watching me from the shadows. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just my imagination. The hotel was old, and old buildings had a way of playing tricks on the mind. I closed the door and locked it again, but the sense of unease clung to me like a second skin. I decided to take a walk around the hotel grounds. I needed to clear my head and shake off the lingering sense of paranoia. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, hoping the fresh air would help me regain some sense of normalcy. As I walked along the cobbled path that wound through the gardens, I couldn't help but feel as though the hotel itself was watching me. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches twisting and swaying unnaturally in the wind. The whole atmosphere felt heavy, like the earth itself was holding its breath. I rounded a corner and came face to face with the same figure I had seen earlier, standing at the edge of the forest, watching the hotel. They hadn't moved an inch since I last saw them. This time, I could make out more details. A tall man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. He stood completely still, as if waiting for something, or someone. I didn't know why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to walk toward him. It was like I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved on their own, pulling me closer to the figure, despite every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn back. But just as I took a step forward, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, and the figure was gone. In the blink of an eye, he vanished, like he had never been there at all. I stood frozen in place, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know what to make of it. My heart raced in my chest as I scanned the empty clearing. There was no sign of the man, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When I returned to the hotel, the sense of unease had deepened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the hotel wasn't just an old building, it was alive in some way. Watching, waiting. Later that evening, I was walking back from dinner when I noticed a strange light flickering from beneath my door. It wasn't the usual warm glow of a lamp, but a cold, flickering light, like a candle that was struggling to stay lit. I hesitated before I opened the door, but when I stepped inside, I was greeted by the unexpected. The room was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The lamp on the bedside table was turned on, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. I knew I hadn't turned it on. I had checked the light before I left, and it was off. But now it was glowing, its pale light pulsing like a heartbeat in the darkness. I rushed to turn it off, but as I reached for the switch, I heard the faintest sound, a low whisper, so quiet it could have been the winds, but it sounded too deliberate. I froze. My hand hovered just above the switch, and I realized, with chilling certainty, that I wasn't alone in the room. The whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. A voice, but not one I recognized. I backed away from the lamp, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was suddenly cold, and I could see my breath in the air as if winter had settled in early. My mind raced, but my body refused to move, frozen by a fear I had never felt before. Then, in the silence, I heard it again, the soft, deliberate knock at the door. That night, the tension in the hotel grew unbearable. The events of the past 2 days had left me on edge, but I tried to convince myself it was just the stress of traveling, the unfamiliar surroundings, and the weight of isolation. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to overtake me. But the silence in the room felt oppressive, like the very walls were holding their breath. The air was unnaturally still, almost thick, and every creak of the building, every groan of the floorboards, seemed to echo louder than it should have. It was as if the hotel was alive, breathing with me, watching me. The soft sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room made my pulse spike. I had gotten used to the occasional footfalls of other guests or staff members, but this was different. These steps were slow, deliberate, and they stopped just outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay still, waiting, listening for any sign of movement. But nothing came. The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick. I lay there, my eyes fixed on the door, willing myself to get up, to open it, to see if anyone was really out there. But my body refused to move, paralyzed by an icy fear. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew they weren't going to stop haunting me. I heard the knock again, soft, almost gentle, but this time it was followed by a faint scraping sound, like fingernails against wood. My blood ran cold. I had been waiting for this moment, but I was not ready for it. My hand instinctively reached for the light switch beside the bed, but as I did, I noticed something else. There was a faint light flickering beneath the door, just like the night before. This time, the light seemed brighter, more insistent, as though something was pushing against it, trying to force its way into the room. I couldn't just lie there and do nothing. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, my feet cold against the wooden floor. I walked toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt colder now, the temperature dropping several degrees in just a matter of minutes. I could see my breath in the air as I reached the door, and the flickering light was almost blinding. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't. Something inside me, a mix of curiosity, dread, and something else, compelled me to open it. The instant I touched the knob, the light flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I opened the door, and as I stepped into the hallway, I felt the temperature drop even further. The air was suffocating, heavy with an almost tangible presence. I looked down the hall, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone, standing at the end of the corridor. A figure, cloaked in shadow, barely visible in the dim light from the overhead lamps. It stood still, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was watching me, waiting. I wasn't sure if it was a trick of the light or my mind playing games with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I began to walk down the hallway toward the figure, every step echoing in the eerie silence. My body was tense, every muscle ready to spring into action, but I felt like I was walking in a dream, unable to control my movements. As I approached the figure, it seemed to dissolve into the darkness, vanishing into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I was alone. But the feeling of being watched lingered, crawling under my skin like an infestation. I turned back toward my room, but before I could reach the door, I heard a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, coming from somewhere deep within the hotel. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, vibrating with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The growl came again, closer this time, and then I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps, coming toward me. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I leaned against the door, trying to steady myself, but the pounding in my chest wouldn't stop. The hotel felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing inward with every passing second. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't sit idly by and let whatever was happening consume me. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by hiding in my room. I grabbed my jacket and headed downstairs. The lobby was just as empty as before. The only sounds, the occasional creak of the building and the hum of the overhead lights. I made my way to the front desk, but the receptionist, an older woman with a stern expression, was nowhere to be found. Her absence was unsettling, as if she had simply vanished. I walked through the lobby, my eyes scanning every corner of the room, looking for anything that could explain the strange occurrences. But there was nothing out of the ordinary. The hotel was still, eerily still, as though time had frozen. I was about to leave when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A door at the far end of the lobby, one I hadn't noticed before. It was small, inconspicuous, and tucked away in a shadowy alcove. The door looked old, weathered, and I could see that the keyhole was covered with dust, as though it hadn't been opened in years. A sudden, overwhelming compulsion washed over me. I had to go through that door. I didn't know why, but I knew that it was the only way I would find the answers I was looking for. I walked toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The wood was cold under my fingers, and I could feel the weight of years pressing against it. When I turned the handle, the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit hallway beyond. The hallway was narrow, and the air felt stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a soft thud. The hallway was lined with old, faded portraits, each one seemingly staring down at me as I moved past them. The further I walked, the more oppressive the air became. It felt like I was walking deeper into the heart of the hotel, into something dark and hidden. As I reached the end of the hallway, I found another door. This one was different. It wasn't old and weathered like the others. It looked brand new, pristine, almost as if it had been placed there just for me. I reached for the handle, my fingers brushing against the cool metal, and when I turned it, I was greeted by the smell of damp earth and decay. The room beyond the door was dark, almost suffocatingly so, but I could make out the shapes of old furniture, covered in thick layers of dust. It felt like a forgotten room, one that had been sealed off from the rest of the hotel for a reason. But as I stepped inside, I heard the sound of something shifting, something moving in the darkness. The darkness in the room beyond seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing up everything in its path. But it was the sound, something shifting, scraping against the floor, that snapped me from my paralysis. It wasn't just the air that felt thick now. The very space around me felt alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to make the next move. I couldn't look away from the room, the edges of my vision swimming in the inky blackness. My hand trembled as it gripped the doorframe, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run, to escape the suffocating tension that pressed against me. But I couldn't. Something held me there, something stronger than fear or reason. I took a tentative step into the room, and the sound of my foot hitting the floor echoed through the silence like a gunshot. I almost expected something to pounce, to attack, but there was nothing. The room was just as I had left it, shrouded in darkness. The smell of mildew and decay clung to the air, making it hard to breathe, like I was inhaling the very essence of something that had been dead for too long. Then a low, guttural growl echoed through the room, sending a ripple of icy fear through my veins. My entire body went stiff, and I stopped dead in my tracks. The growl wasn't just a sound, it was a warning. A warning that I was not alone. I wasn't alone, but I didn't know who or what else was in that room with me. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy scraping against the floor. It was coming closer, and every instinct in me told me to run, to get out of there and never look back. But I couldn't tear myself away. The mystery, the questions, the overwhelming need to understand what was happening, it all kept me rooted to the spot. I forced myself to take another step into the room. The floorboards creaked under my weight, protest against the disturbance. My eyes began to adjust to the dim light, and I could make out the shapes of old furniture, a bed covered in sheets that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in years, and a large wardrobe tucked against the far wall. But it was the corner of the room that caught my attention. There, in the shadowy recess, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, something my mind was conjuring out of the darkness. But then I saw it again, a figure, low to the ground, shifting like an animal, something hunched and unnatural. My breath hitched in my throat as my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was slowly crawling toward me, dragging itself along the floor with disturbing ease. It was covered in shadows, its shape shifting and warping, making it impossible to discern what it truly was. But I could hear it now, the scrape of its limbs against the floor, the heavy, labored breathing coming from its direction. It was getting closer, and I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, unable to carry me away from the horror unfolding before me. Then, as if sensing my hesitation, the figure stopped. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze on me, felt its eyes burning into my skin, as though it were studying me, waiting for me to make the next move. The air grew colder, the chill creeping up my spine and settling deep in my bones. In a sudden, jolting movement, the figure lunged toward me. My heart stopped, the world going silent for a brief moment as I braced myself for impact. But just as quickly as it had moved, it froze again, hovering just inches from my face, its breath hot and foul against my skin. I could feel it, the weight of its presence, the sinister force pressing down on me. It wasn't just a monster. It was something worse, something ancient, something that had been waiting for a long time to be seen. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but no sound escaped me. My voice was gone, my body locked in place, paralyzed by the overwhelming terror that gripped me. I couldn't understand what this thing was, what it wanted, or why it had chosen me. But I knew it wasn't going to let me go. Not now, not ever. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature backed away, retreating into the shadows with unnerving speed. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, the cold seeping into my very soul. I could feel the presence of the thing still lingering, just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for the right moment to strike again. My mind raced, desperately trying to piece together the fragments of what had just happened. I was trapped. I couldn't leave the room. I couldn't escape the hotel. The growl still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder that something was watching me, following me, waiting for the moment when it would reveal its true nature. The air around me thickened, pressing down harder, suffocating me. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deep within the hotel. The creature wasn't alone. There were others. I didn't know what they were, but I could feel their presence, feel the weight of their gaze on me, even though I couldn't see them. I turned, desperate to find some way out, but the door I had entered through had vanished. There was no exit, no escape. I was trapped, sealed in a room with something monstrous, something that thrived on fear, something that would never let me leave. I reached for the wardrobe, desperate to hide, but as my fingers brushed against the wood, the door creaked open by itself. A rush of cold air poured from within, carrying with it the smell of rot and decay. Something was inside the wardrobe. I didn't want to know what, but I had no choice. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature's growl reverberated through the room once more, and I felt the floor shift beneath me, the hotel groaning as though it were alive, a living, breathing entity that was feeding on my terror. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something crawling behind me. Slowly, deliberately. Its breath was hot and ragged, coming closer with every passing second. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The fear paralyzed me, and as I felt the coldness of its presence behind me, I knew that I was no longer alone in the room. The cold, suffocating air of the room was unbearable now. I could feel the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing against my chest, the dread crawling under my skin like something alive, constantly shifting and writhing. The scraping sound of the creature's movement was growing louder, closer, each rasp sending a shockwave of terror through my body. I had no plan, no idea how to escape. I could barely think, my thoughts scattered, consumed by the need to survive, to get away from whatever was in this forsaken hotel. The wardrobe creaked again, a bone-chilling sound that made my blood run cold. Whatever was inside, I knew it wasn't something natural, something of this world. I had to move, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't even take a step. My hands shook as I tried to brace myself, trying to hold on to whatever shred of control I had left, but the fear was overwhelming. The uncertainty of what was coming next gnawed at me, clawing at the edges of my sanity. Then, as if the very air had conspired against me, the creature behind me let out a low, guttural growl. It was so close, I could feel the warmth of its breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. My mind was barely holding together, and I knew if I turned, I would break. But something, some primal instinct, told me that if I didn't act now, it would be too late. I had to fight. I had to survive. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I flung myself toward the door. It had reappeared, but this time it wasn't just a doorway. It was my only chance. The air in the room thickened as I rushed forward, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I sprinted across the room, my breath ragged, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. The sound of my footsteps reverberated in my ears, louder than the growl, louder than the crushing silence that had once held me captive. But as I reached the door, something blocked my way. I collided with it, my hands instinctively reaching out to grasp the handle, but it was jammed. The door wouldn't open. It was locked. Panic surged through me, and I yanked harder, slamming my body against the wood, hoping that sheer force would break it open. Nothing. The door wouldn't budge. And then I heard it, louder this time, the unmistakable sound of something moving swiftly through the room, closing in on me. The room seemed to stretch on forever, the walls narrowing, the shadows closing in around me. The thing was coming. I could feel it, hear it, taste the metallic tang of fear in the back of my throat. I had to think. There had to be another way out. In that moment, my mind raced, my senses heightened by the adrenaline coursing through me. I scanned the room, my eyes falling on the window. The thick curtains hung closed, hiding whatever lay beyond. But there was no time to hesitate. I lunged for the window, yanking at the fabric with desperate hands. The room seemed to groan beneath me, the walls bending, the very air quivering in response to my actions. The window slid open with a reluctant screech, revealing the night outside. The wind howled through the crack, sending a chill through my bones, but it was freedom. It was my only hope. I climbed through, my hands shaking as I gripped the ledge, my feet struggling to find purchase on the narrow windowsill. Just as I was about to swing my leg out, a terrible sound filled the room behind me. The growl was so close now, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up in terror. But I couldn't look back. I couldn't afford to. I pushed myself harder, my arms trembling from the effort, my body stiff with fear. And then, with one last desperate movement, I was out. I fell into the cold night air, my body landing with a thud on the ground below. I scrambled to my feet, my mind barely processing what had just happened, my heart still racing in my chest. The darkness around me felt alive, oppressive, but I had to move. I had to keep going. I couldn't stop now. I glanced back at the window. I could barely see the outline of the hotel, its windows like hollow eyes staring back at me. I didn't know if the creature had followed me, if it was still in the building, or if it had been something in my mind all along. But I didn't care anymore. I had escaped. I was out. I ran. The night was dark, silent, but I didn't care. I didn't look back. Every step I took felt like a victory, like I was outrunning the terror that had consumed me in that hotel. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. As long as I was away from that place, from whatever dark force had taken root there. By the time I reached the main road, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, the sky streaked with shades of purple and orange. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest town, my legs sore, my breath ragged, my mind in a haze. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, not at first. I couldn't. The words didn't seem real. The terror still clung to me, wrapping its tendrils around my mind, making it impossible to speak of it without feeling the cold grip of fear tightening in my chest. I never went back to that hotel. I never spoke of it again. But sometimes, when the darkness feels too heavy, or when I hear the faintest of noises in the night, I wonder if I really escaped at all. Maybe it was never about running away. Maybe it was about surviving. Or maybe it was something worse, something that followed me, something that's still watching, still waiting, just beyond the edges of my perception. It's been years since that night, and yet I still can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, every whisper of movement when I'm alone, it all sends a shiver down my spine, even now. It's not like before, though. I don't feel the pressing weight of fear quite as intensely. but the remnants of that terror still linger like a dark stain, never fully fading away. I moved far away from that hotel after the incident. I tried to distance myself from everything connected to it, tried to forget. But you can't truly forget something like that. Not when it's burned into your mind, not when it feels so real, so unshakable. In the years since, I've tried to put the pieces together, tried to understand what happened that night. But every answer feels incomplete, every explanation unsatisfactory. The creature, whatever it was, never made sense. It defied logic, defied everything I thought I knew about the world. I spoke to a few locals in the town near the hotel, trying to gather information, but they either denied knowing anything strange about the place or were too afraid to speak of it. Some even seemed to be hiding something. I never could get a straight answer. I came across old records about the hotel once, buried in a dusty corner of a library. It was nothing more than a footnote in history, a place that had seen its fair share of visitors and tragedies. I couldn't help but wonder if it was all part of some larger twisted history, something that had been lurking in the shadows for decades, maybe even centuries. But that thought only added to the gnawing unease that still grips me whenever I think about it. The strangest thing, though, is that I haven't been able to find anyone who has stayed there since. The hotel is still there, or at least I assume it is. I've never gone back to check. The place was abandoned when I left, and I haven't heard any reports of people staying there since. Some say it was a tourist trap, a relic of the past that had fallen into ruin. Others say it was something much darker, something that never fully let go of its inhabitants. I sometimes wonder if it's waiting for someone else to come along, waiting for someone else to stumble into its grasp, to experience what I did. Part of me feels guilty, like I left something unfinished, like I was supposed to do something to stop it, to destroy it. But what could I have done? How could anyone stop something like that? Maybe it's not meant to be stopped. Maybe it's meant to feed on fear, on those who wander too close. I try not to dwell on it too much. I've moved on, built a life far away from that cursed place. I have friends, a steady job, and a semblance of normalcy. But even in my quietest moments, I can feel it, the sense that I'm being watched. The unease that claws at the back of my mind when I'm alone in the dark. It's like the hotel never really let me go, like it's still somehow part of me, still there in the corners of my mind. I've become obsessed with the idea of finding answers, of unraveling the mystery of what happened. But I know that returning to the hotel would only be asking for trouble. And yet, I can't help but wonder, what if I'm wrong? What if there's something there I missed? What if I was supposed to see something, understand something that could have changed everything? But I can't go back, not after everything. The memory of the growl, the way the door wouldn't open, the sensation of something lurking just behind me, it's too vivid, too raw. I don't want to face it again, and I certainly don't want to confront whatever it was that followed me out that night. Some nights, when I lie awake in the dark, I think about the hotel. I think about the things I felt, the things I heard, and I wonder if they're still there, waiting. Maybe it's foolish, but I can't help but believe that there's something more to the story, something hidden in the shadows that only a few are meant to understand. And maybe that's why I can't let go, why I'm still haunted by it, still drawn to it, even from afar. The truth is, I'll never fully escape what happened that night. The terror, the fear, the unknown, it's a part of me now. It's like a scar that will never fully heal, a memory that will never fade. But there's one thing I've come to understand over the years. Some places are cursed. Some things are not meant to be understood, not meant to be meddled with. The hotel is one of those places. And as much as I try to put it behind me, as much as I try to move forward, I know that a part of me will always be tethered to that night. So, here I am, still living my life, still trying to outrun the shadows that haunt me. I don't know if you'll ever be free of them. Maybe no one can ever truly escape the things they've seen, the things they've felt in the darkest corners of their mind. It was the summer of 2017, and I was feeling a little restless. I had spent months in the city, absorbed in the daily grind of work and responsibilities. It felt like I hadn't had a chance to breathe in ages. So, when my friend Noah called me up with an offer to escape to a remote cabin in the woods for a weekend, I was all in. We had been friends since college, always getting into adventures of varying degrees of wildness. But this idea of a secluded weekend in the woods sounded like the perfect escape. Just the two of us, no distractions, no obligations, just some time to reconnect with nature, get away from the noise, and reset. So I packed my bags, grabbed some gear, and we hit the road. The cabin Noah had found was tucked away in the woods, a good 2-hour drive from the nearest town. It wasn't luxurious, but that was part of the charm. It was simple, rustic, with a big fireplace, wooden floors, and a porch that overlooked a dense, unspoiled forest. The isolation was exactly what we needed, or so we thought. When we arrived, it was late afternoon. The air smelled fresh, earthy, like rain, even though it hadn't rained in days. There were no other cabins in sight, only miles of trees in every direction. The silence was so profound, it almost felt suffocating at first. Not a single car, not even a distant sound of people. It was just us, the trees, and the sky. We unpacked and started a fire in the fireplace, making the cabin feel warm and inviting. The first few hours were just spent talking about everything, old times, the things we wanted to do with our lives, and the usual banter that filled the spaces between the big questions. As night fell, we sat on the porch, sipping hot drinks and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, but there was something strange about the stillness. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in the city, where the world is just holding its breath. No, this was different. The forest was silent, but it wasn't still. There was something beneath the quiet, an energy that felt heavy, like the trees themselves were watching us, listening to every word we said. I chalked it up to my imagination, just the product of a mind unused to such isolation. We talked a little longer before heading inside to call it a night. I remember lying in bed, staring at the wooden beams above me, the sound of the wind gently brushing against the cabin's walls. I tried to push away the unease that had begun to settle in my chest. It was nothing, just the unfamiliarity of the place. But then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard a faint sound from outside. It was so subtle that I almost dismissed it at first, a rustle, like something moving through the underbrush. But this wasn't an animal. The sound was too deliberate, too slow. A pause, followed by another rustle, closer this time. I held my breath, straining to listen. The silence that followed was almost worse. It felt like the forest was holding its own breath, waiting for something to happen. The unease turned into a tight knot in my stomach. I rolled over to Noah's bed. "Hey, did you hear that?" I whispered. His response came almost immediately. "Yeah, I heard it too. I thought it was just an animal, but there was something about it. Something that didn't sit right." Noah tried to shake it off, saying it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. Not by animals, but something else. Something that didn't belong in the woods. Noah eventually fell asleep, but I stayed awake, staring into the darkness, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there. Was it just my nerves, or was something in the woods trying to make its presence known? The wind picked up again, and with it came that same eerie rustling sound, this time from a different direction. My heart started to race. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if something out there was moving, just out of sight. It was then that I decided I wasn't going to sleep anytime soon. I sat up in bed, wide awake, listening, waiting. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified, and each gust of wind seemed louder than the last. The sounds of the woods were changing. But for that night, nothing else happened. The next morning, we woke up to the typical sounds of the forest, the birds chirping, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered in the back of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I didn't say anything to Noah about it. It seemed silly, right? We were in the woods, rustling leaves, animals, maybe the wind. It was probably nothing. But deep down, I knew something was different. The day started off with a sense of normalcy that helped me push away the growing sense of unease from the previous night. We had breakfast, a simple spread of eggs, toast, and some coffee. We talked about the weather, the plans for the day, and even made jokes about how Noah had already started roughing it by setting up his hammock outside. It was the kind of morning that felt right, a perfect beginning to a weekend escape. We decided to go for a hike through the woods. The cabin was situated near a few trails, and though we didn't have any real plan, we both figured it would be a good idea to explore the area around us. Noah grabbed his backpack and a bottle of water, and I slipped on my boots, mentally preparing myself for the kind of adventure we'd both been looking for. It was an easy-going decision, nothing that felt out of place at all. As we made our way through the thick trees, the forest seemed alive with the sound of nature, birds, the occasional rustle of smaller animals in the underbrush, and the soft whisper of the wind. The woods were peaceful, but as we walked deeper, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first, a strange sort of heaviness in the air, a tension that settled just under the surface. The path, once easy to follow, began to feel less familiar, the trees growing denser, their trunks twisted in strange ways. We continued walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer just in a forest, but somewhere else, somewhere less ordinary. There were parts of the woods that just didn't feel right. The sunlight filtering through the trees seemed dimmer, colder. It wasn't the heat, but the quality of the light that had changed. I couldn't quite explain it, but it felt like the forest itself was holding something back. I don't know about you, but this place feels, I don't know, strange, I said to Noah, trying to sound casual. He glanced around, a faint smile on his face. What do you mean? I don't know. It's like the air's thicker here or something, I said, looking around at the trees that seemed to loom just a little too tall, too close. It feels off. Noah stopped for a moment, looking down at the trail. You're probably just tired. We've been walking for a while. Maybe he was right. The hike had taken longer than I had expected, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The way the trees seemed to close in around us, blocking the sunlight, made the forest feel suffocating. As we moved forward, we reached a clearing, a small, wide space with a few large boulders scattered around. There was a strange stillness here, unlike any other part of the forest. It wasn't that the air was heavy, but there was an odd, unnerving quiet to it, like everything was holding its breath. Noah pulled out a small knife from his bag, casually tapping it against the stone as he sat down on one of the larger boulders. You okay? He asked, sensing I was still on edge. I don't know. This place is weird, I replied, my voice quieter than usual. Dude, we're in the middle of nowhere. It's just nature. No need to overthink it, Noah said with a half-hearted chuckle, trying to ease my nerves. I nodded, but something about his words didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We had wandered far enough into the forest by now that we were truly alone, no sounds of human life around us. Just us and the endless stretch of trees. The thought made me uneasy, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. We sat there for a while, just taking in the surroundings. That's when it happened. At first, it was just a flicker, something that could easily have been dismissed as a trick of the light. But then it came again. A movement just out of the corner of my eye, a shape darting behind a tree on the edge of the clearing. I stiffened. Did you see that? Noah glanced at me. See what? I swear I saw something over there, I said, pointing toward the trees. He shrugged it off. Probably just a deer or something. You're jumpy today, man. But I wasn't convinced. The shape hadn't looked like any animal it'd seen before. It was too fast, too deliberate, and there was no sound to accompany it. Not even a rustle of leaves. Just a flash. I tried to ignore it, but the unease kept building. My eyes kept scanning the trees, darting from shadow to shadow. I tried to focus on the fact that we were here to enjoy the woods, but the creeping feeling that something wasn't right gnawed at the back of my mind. We decided to head back to the cabin, but the path we had taken was no longer as familiar as before. We kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking in circles. I tried to stay calm, to tell myself that I was just overthinking it, but every step seemed to take us farther from where we had started. I glanced at Noah. "Something's wrong," I said, my voice now more urgent. "Relax. We're just lost. That's all," he replied, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. He, too, was beginning to sense something was off. The quiet of the forest was beginning to feel oppressive, the stillness unnerving. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached a spot I recognized, an old tree with a large twisted root system that had marked the beginning of the trail. But as we approached it, something caught my eye again, a flash of movement just behind the tree. This time, I was sure of it. There was something there, something watching us. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Did you see that?" Noah turned around, his face pale. "Yeah, that wasn't a deer." The air grew heavier, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Something was following us, but it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something we couldn't see, but we both felt its presence. We started walking faster, not speaking, but both of us were suddenly aware of the growing sense of dread. Every crack of a twig beneath our feet seemed louder than the last. Every whisper of wind sounded like it was carrying something. The trees felt taller, more imposing, as though they were closing in on us. It wasn't the forest anymore. It was something else, something old and deep and watching us. When we finally made it back to the cabin, I could feel the tension in my shoulders release just a little, but the unease didn't leave. We both hurried inside, locking the door behind us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We just sat there, staring at the fire, trying to make sense of what had happened. Noah was the first to break the silence. "What the hell was that back there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my mind racing. But it wasn't just my imagination. The night felt like a weight upon the cabin, heavier than it ever had before. The once comforting crackle of the fire now seemed distant, as if it were an echo from another place. We both sat in silence, glancing at the door, then at the windows. Every little sound from the outside, the groan of the wood settling, the rustle of leaves against the cabin's exterior, sounded too loud, too deliberate. And there was no denying the truth. Something was out there. The wind howled through the trees, a hollow, mournful sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The shadows outside seemed longer than they should have been, as though they were creeping closer to the window, inch by inch. Every time the wind rattled the cabin, I found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure standing just beyond the glass, watching us. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched. The sense of wrongness lingered in the air, thick like smoke. We had barely spoken since returning inside, both of us unsure of what to say. But I could feel the tension building between us, an unspoken understanding that whatever we had experienced earlier wasn't just a figment of our imagination. Something was very wrong, and we were in the middle of it. I broke the silence first. "We need to figure out what's going on," I said quietly, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Noah nodded, but his face was pale. "You don't think we should just leave, do you?" The thought had crossed my mind, but for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. I wanted to get out of there, but something kept me rooted in place, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the creeping suspicion that whatever was happening was tied to this place, and leaving wouldn't change anything. The thing out there, whatever it was, had already found us. It wasn't going to stop. "We can't just leave without knowing what it is," I said finally, forcing the words out. "We need answers." Noah hesitated, but then his eyes hardened with determination. "Okay, but how do we even start?" The fire crackled and popped in the background, the only sound filling the room. I thought about it for a moment. There had to be something here, something that could explain why the forest felt wrong, why the shadows outside felt like they were waiting for us. We grabbed flashlights and headed for the door. The night air hit us like a cold wave, but it wasn't the cold that made me shiver. It was the feeling that the forest was alive in a way that it shouldn't have been. We walked carefully, the beams from our flashlights cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows on the trees as we made our way back to the clearing. It wasn't long before we reached the spot where we had seen the figure earlier. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I pushed the fear aside. This wasn't about being afraid anymore. This was about finding out what had been lurking in the woods. The clearing was still. The air was thick, but the wind had died down, leaving behind a heavy silence. There was no animal sound, no rustling of leaves. It was as if the entire forest had frozen in place, waiting. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam trembling slightly as my hand shook. I had to keep it together, I kept telling myself. What are we even looking for? Noah whispered, his voice unnaturally low. I don't know, I replied, my voice tense. But we need to find something. We both stepped forward, slowly, carefully, our eyes darting from one tree to the next. The ground beneath our boots felt soft, like it hadn't been disturbed in ages. There were no animal tracks, no signs of life, nothing but the occasional leaf drifting to the ground, breaking the unnatural stillness. And then, just as I thought we might be getting nowhere, I spotted it, a small, odd symbol carved into one of the nearby trees. It was subtle, almost hidden by the bark, but it was unmistakable. A series of sharp, jagged lines, arranged in a pattern that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't natural. No animal would have carved that. I pointed it out to Noah, who knelt down to inspect it more closely. What the hell is that? He muttered under his breath. I don't know, I said, a chill running down my spine. But I think we just found something. We spent the next few minutes looking around the clearing, our flashlights catching strange markings on the trees, some of them faint, others more recent looking. The symbols seemed to be all around us, almost as if the forest itself was trying to communicate something. But what? What was it trying to say? The more I looked, the more the air around me seemed to pulse, like the forest was alive in ways I couldn't comprehend. The shadows beneath the trees deepened, becoming more pronounced, and I could almost feel the earth itself shifting underfoot. A low hum filled the air, barely audible at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. It was as if the forest was breathing with us, moving with us. And the more we uncovered, the more I felt that we were not supposed to be here. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack behind us, a sound so loud and sudden that it made us both jump. My flashlight jerked toward the noise, but all I could see were the trees, standing silently as ever. What was that? Noah whispered. I don't know, I replied, my voice tight. But we should probably head back. We turned, heading back to the path, but as we did, the humming noise seemed to follow us, echoing in the distance, just out of reach. The forest was alive, aware of our presence, and it wasn't going to let us leave easily. As we made our way back toward the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just behind us, watching us from the shadows. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the sensation grew, until it was almost unbearable. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the trees, standing silent and still. We reached the cabin in silence, both of us out of breath and trembling. I locked the door behind us as soon as we stepped inside, my hand shaking as I turned the key in the lock. We both stood there for a moment, the only sound the heavy breathing in the room. What do we do now? Noah asked, his voice tight with fear. We wait, I said, though I had no idea what we were waiting for. The cabin felt colder now, the warmth of the fire doing little to comfort us. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, howling through the trees. But it wasn't the wind that scared me anymore. It was the feeling that something was coming. Something that had been watching us, waiting for us to step too far into its domain. We couldn't run from it. It was here, and we had no idea what it wanted. The fire crackled weakly, its glow a far cry from the warmth it once provided. The cabin was silent, the heavy atmosphere wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was coming. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt as though every nerve in my body was on edge, primed for something I couldn't explain. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder than it should have been. Every whisper of wind outside felt like it was carrying a message. A warning. Noah sat across from me, his face pale, eyes wide and unblinking, as though he were staring into the very soul of the darkness that surrounded us. He hadn't spoken for what felt like hours. The tension between us was unbearable, each of us lost in our own spiraling thoughts, each of us dreading what the night might bring. But neither of us could leave. Something kept us rooted here, unwilling to face whatever lay outside. Then it happened. The first loud thump came from outside the cabin, so abrupt and forceful that the windows rattled. I jumped out of my seat, the chairs scraping across the wooden floor, and Noah did the same, his eyes wide with disbelief. The thump was followed by another, louder this time, and then a third, the sound of something large and heavy striking the walls of the cabin. I could barely breathe, the air thick with fear, suffocating. My legs trembled as I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding in my throat. What was out there? The forest had been silent only moments before. What had changed? Noah looked at me, his voice barely a whisper. We need to do something. We need to get out of here. But even as he spoke the words, I knew we couldn't leave. Something was out there, something that didn't want us to leave. My body was gripped with terror, and a voice in the back of my mind screamed that we were too far gone, that it was already too late. Another thump, and then silence. We stood there in the stillness, waiting for the next sound, but nothing came. The air was eerily quiet, too quiet. The fire's flickering glow seemed to dim in the sudden darkness that enveloped the cabin, casting long, stretching shadows across the walls. Then the door creaked. The sound was faint at first, barely perceptible, but it grew louder, the hinged protest under some unseen weight. I didn't have to look to know what was happening. Something was trying to get inside. Something was inside. My heart stopped, my breath catching in my throat as I backed away from the door, my eyes glued to the handle. Noah was already moving toward the window, his breath shallow as he peered out into the night, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The tension in the room was suffocating, every nerve on high alert, every sound amplified in the silence. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the blood rushing in my veins, as the weight of the moment settled over us. Then the door burst open with a violent crash, splintering the wood as though it were nothing more than paper. The force of it sent us both stumbling backward, our feet tripping over the furniture as we tried to scramble away from the door. And there it was. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and spindly, as though it had been stretched and warped by something otherworldly. Its skin was a pale, sickly gray, stretched tight over its thin frame, with veins that pulsed unnaturally beneath the surface. Its eyes were wide, hollow, empty pits, black as coal, yet they glistened in the faint light of the fire as it focused on us with an intensity that made my stomach churn. It didn't make a sound at first. It simply stood there, filling the doorway, its unnatural presence suffocating the room. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My body felt frozen, as though I were trapped in some kind of nightmare, unable to wake up. And then it stepped forward. The creature moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, its limbs bending at odd angles as it entered the cabin, the floor creaking under its weight. Its eyes never left us, never blinked, as though it was studying us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Noah and I stumbled backward, our backs hitting the walls as we tried to get as far away from the creature as possible. But there was nowhere to go. The cabin, once our refuge, now felt like a prison, closing in around us with every passing second. It tilted its head, the motion so smooth and unnatural that it made my skin crawl. There was no sound, no voice, just the sickening sense that it was trying to understand us, trying to figure us out. My breathing was shallow, my hands trembling, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I had never felt fear like this before. And then, it did something I will never forget. It spoke, but the voice, it wasn't a voice at all. It was more of a thought, a presence, an overwhelming sensation that flooded my mind with a single word, one that made my blood run cold. Leave! The word echoed in my skull, reverberating through my body, shaking me to my core. I could feel it in my bones, in my very soul, as though it were commanding me to leave now before it was too late. But I couldn't move, I couldn't run. I was paralyzed, trapped in that moment, caught in the creature's gaze. Noah, too, stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth agape as he looked at the thing in front of us. I could see the terror in his eyes, the realization of just how powerless we were. Leave! The creature's thought crashed into me again, harder this time, more insistent. But still, I couldn't move. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though the very space around us was shrinking. And then, something changed. The thing's eyes, they weren't black anymore. They were white, a blinding, piercing white, like a flash of light that filled the cabin. I could feel it searing into my mind, into my soul, as if it were burning away everything, erasing everything I had ever known. The pain was unbearable, like my brain was being torn apart from the inside out. And then, nothing. The cabin was silent once more. The fire was gone, snuffed out by an unseen force. The room was bathed in darkness, and for a moment I thought I was dead. That this was it, that we had crossed a line we could never come back from. But we weren't dead. We were still alive, though barely. The creature was gone. The door had closed behind it, leaving us in a suffocating darkness. I could barely breathe, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. Noah stood beside me, his face ashen, his body trembling uncontrollably. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't know. I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that whatever it was, it hadn't finished with us yet. The silence that followed was deafening, every creak of the floorboards beneath our feet echoing in the empty cabin. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, cold and clammy. The terror that had gripped me moments earlier hadn't faded. It still held me in its vice-like grip, squeezing tighter with every passing second. We stood there, in the dark, with nothing but the cold, stale air around us. The weight of what had happened still hung heavy between us. Noah looked at me, his eyes wide, his breath ragged, as if he too was trying to process the nightmare we had just lived through. His lips parted, but no words came out. There was nothing to say, not yet. I stumbled toward the door, my legs shaking beneath me as I reached for the handle. The cabin was eerily still, the world outside untouched by the chaos that had unfolded in that small room. But I couldn't stay here any longer. I couldn't stay in this place where everything had gone wrong, where the nightmare had started. We had to leave. I pulled open the door, the cool night air washing over me, but it was a relief that didn't last long. The same darkness that had filled the cabin now seemed to stretch endlessly before us. The trees around the cabin loomed like silent, watching sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out as though they wanted to pull us back inside, to trap us in the nightmare that had just begun. Noah hesitated for a moment, staring into the night as if he could somehow see what lay ahead, but there was nothing. The forest was still, too still. The silence was unsettling, as if the entire world had been swallowed up by whatever force had invaded our lives. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, the words catching in his throat. I didn't know if I was sure. I didn't know anything anymore. But I did know that staying here was worse than walking into the unknown. "We have no choice," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "We need to leave. Now." And so, we ran. The forest was alive with the sounds of the night, but it wasn't the comforting hum of crickets or the rustle of leaves. It was something darker, something that felt wrong. The wind howled through the trees, and branches scraped against the ground, but there was no breeze to cause it. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching us, waiting for us to falter. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, as though the very earth was trying to drag me back. The air was thick, pressing in on me from all sides, making it harder to breathe with each passing moment. Noah was behind me, just a few paces, but I could hear his labored breath, the sound of his shoes pounding against the uneven ground. His panic was palpable, just as mine was. And then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. A whisper. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, filling the air around me with a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The trees swayed, their limbs twisting in unnatural ways, as if they were moving closer to us. The whisper became a voice, but it wasn't human. It was a sound, a vibration in the air, a sensation that gripped my chest and squeezed until I couldn't breathe. Leave! I couldn't even tell where the voice came from, but it was there, in the air, surrounding us, pressing in on us like an invisible force. I felt a weight on my chest, a pressure that made it harder to move, harder to breathe. But we kept going. Noah's voice broke through my panic. We can't outrun it, can we? I didn't have the answer. I didn't know, but I didn't stop running. We couldn't stop. If we stopped, I was sure we would never leave this forest alive. The trees loomed closer now, their dark branches scraping against my arms and face as we pushed through the underbrush, stumbling over rocks and roots. I could feel the ground beneath me give way in places, the earth crumbling as if it were eroding beneath our feet. It was as if the forest itself was trying to swallow us whole, to drag us back into the darkness where it was safe for whatever had been haunting us. I could hear Noah's breath, heavy and ragged, but there was something else, something behind us. Something moving through the trees, keeping pace with us. It was faint at first, just the sound of twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming after us. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We were close to the edge of the forest now, the trees thinning out, the faint outline of the road ahead barely visible through the gaps. We were so close, so close. My legs burned, my body screamed in protest, but I pushed through the pain, my focus fixed on the small sliver of light that marked the edge of the woods. The sound behind us grew louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder for the briefest second, and that was all it took. There, emerging from the trees, was the thing, the creature. It was following us, its pale, twisted form emerging from the shadows like a ghost, its long limbs reaching out as if to grab us. It moved with unnatural speed, its body jerking and twitching with every step. "Run!" I shouted, the words tearing out of my throat. I pushed myself harder, my heart racing as I saw the light of the road ahead. Noah was ahead of me now, his legs moving faster than they ever had. But I could hear the creature behind us, gaining ground with every step. And then, finally, we were free. The road! The creature stopped at the tree line, watching us with those empty, hollow eyes. It didn't chase us any further. It just stood there, its form vanishing into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, panting and gasping for breath. The night was still, the oppressive weight of the forest lifted, but the fear still clung to us like a second skin. We didn't speak for a long time, our minds too tangled in the chaos we had just survived. We had escaped. For now. But I knew it wasn't over. The thing wasn't gone, it had only let us go. It was still out there, still watching, still waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't finished with us yet. As we stumbled toward the nearest town, the only thing I could think was this. I would never come back here. Never. The forest, the creature, the nightmare, it would remain behind me, a shadow in the dark, a memory I would carry with me for the rest of my life. We didn't speak much after we left the woods behind us, our silence a reflection of everything that had happened. The night was still, the road ahead of us stretching endlessly in the moonlight. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, even out here, into the safety of the open space. We had managed to escape, for now, but I couldn't help but wonder how much longer our luck would hold. Would we always be looking over our shoulders, wondering if the thing would find us again? Noah, who had been walking slightly ahead of me, paused and turned around. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "You think it's over?" he asked, his voice rough, as though he too was afraid of saying the words out loud. I didn't have an answer. The forest had been a place of nightmares, yes, but there was something more to it, something deeper that I couldn't quite place. As we stood there, looking back toward the trees, I felt an unease settle in my chest once again. The road was empty, the night was quiet, but the forest behind us felt like it was still alive, still watching. "Well, never know," I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. "But we have to keep moving forward." He didn't argue, and we continued down the road, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the stillness. The small town ahead was a welcome sight, a promise of normalcy, of safety. But the closer we got to it, the more I realized that the nightmare wasn't something that could be left behind so easily. There was a part of me that wanted to believe it was all over, that the thing would stay buried in that forest, that it would never come for us again. But the rational part of my mind knew better. That creature, that presence, it wasn't something that could be defeated by running. No, it was something much older, something that lived in the darkness, in the forgotten corners of the world. It didn't need to chase us. It had all the time in the world. We made it into the town before sunrise, and I could finally let out a breath I hadn't realized it'd been holding. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the empty roads. The town was peaceful, the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. It was a relief, but it didn't feel real. I kept expecting to see the thing in the shadows, lurking just out of sight. I kept expecting to hear the whispers again, to feel that weight pressing down on me, reminding me of what we had left behind. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, just the stillness. We didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe us? What could we possibly say to make them understand? People in the town had their own lives to live, their own concerns. They wouldn't care about the creature in the woods or the whispers that had followed us out of the darkness. So we said nothing and tried to pretend it hadn't happened. But it had. It was always there, in the back of my mind, a shadow that refused to fade. I stayed in the town for a few more days, my nerves raw, but nothing else happened. Life went on, and the world didn't stop turning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that whatever had followed us in the woods hadn't gone away. It was just biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Noah left the town after a week. He didn't say goodbye, didn't explain why, but I knew. He was as haunted as I was, and I could see the same fear in his eyes that I carried with me. He couldn't stay, not with that thing still out there. I stayed behind, trying to rebuild my life, but the memories never stopped. I still dreamed about the woods, about the thing that had chased us, and sometimes, in the quiet moments, I'd swear I could hear the whispers in the dark. It's been years since that night, and I've moved on. I've tried to forget. I've tried to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, just a trick of the mind, a product of fear and exhaustion. But there are times when the weight of the memories is too much to bear. There are nights when I hear the sound of rustling leaves, and I know, deep down, that I'm not alone. I can still feel it, that presence. And I can't help but wonder if it's still waiting for me. Maybe it's a part of me now, something I can't escape, something that follows me, always lurking in the corners of my mind. Or maybe it's out there, in the woods, still watching, still waiting. I don't know if we'll ever be free of it. I don't know if it will ever stop. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget that night. And no matter where I go, or how far I run, I'll always feel the weight of the darkness on my shoulders, as if that thing is right behind me, just out of sight, watching, waiting, and maybe, just maybe, it's still hunting. For me, for you, for anyone who dares to walk too far into the woods. It was the summer of 2014 when I first found myself at that lighthouse. I had been working as a caretaker for several months, managing the upkeep of the lighthouse, which had been out of service for decades. The job itself was solitary, quiet, and peaceful, perfect for someone like me who wasn't looking for anything too exciting. I had a few friends in town, but not many. I preferred to keep to myself. The lighthouse itself was a beautiful yet eerie structure. It stood tall against the sea breeze, its white paint peeling, giving it an abandoned look. Its towering height seemed to challenge the sky itself, a silent sentinel keeping watch over the jagged rocks below. The lantern room, where the light once shone brightly for passing ships, was now just a relic of the past. The interior had been neglected for years, filled with old, broken furniture and long-forgotten supplies. The place had its charm, but there was always an undercurrent of something off. I had always found comfort in solitude, but something about this place didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the fact that I was alone. Plenty of people live alone and find peace in it. It was something about the lighthouse, the way it seemed to hum with a life of its own. It wasn't just the creaky floorboards or the sound of wind howling through the cracks in the walls. It was something more. Most of my days were spent repairing windows, sweeping the floors, and painting the exterior, tasks that anyone would consider mundane. But there was a certain calm in knowing that everything around me was old, worn, and familiar. Nothing really changed, and that was exactly how I liked it. I would climb the spiral staircase to the lantern room each day, staring out across the sea, watching the waves crash against the shore, hearing the distant cry of seagulls. The endless expanse of water brought a kind of tranquility that only a few would understand. But over time, I began to feel something subtle but unmistakable. There were days when the silence felt too heavy, as if the very air around me was thick with unspoken things. The lights would flicker at odd hours, and I would often hear the sound of something scraping against the walls, like fingernails against stone. At first, I told myself it was just the wind. After all, this was a coastal area, and the wind could be unpredictable. But as the weeks went by, those sounds became harder to ignore. I began to hear things at night too. Small, almost imperceptible noises, soft footsteps down the hall, whispers that were so faint I couldn't tell if they were real or if I was imagining them. But I wasn't alone. I was sure of it. One evening, as I sat in the caretaker's quarters, writing in my journal, I felt a sudden chill sweep through the room. It was summer, and there was no reason for the cold to feel so unnatural. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I looked around the room, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. It was then that I noticed something strange, something I hadn't seen before. The window across the room was open, just a crack, even though I distinctly remembered closing it earlier in the day. I got up to shut the window, my heart beating faster now, but when I turned to face the glass, I saw something I shouldn't have seen. There was a figure standing on the rocks below, just outside the lighthouse space. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. He stood motionless, staring up at me. I couldn't make out any details, but the presence of the figure sent a shiver down my spine. What was he doing there? There was no way anyone could have gotten that close to the lighthouse without me noticing. And there was no way anyone would have been crazy enough to stand out there at this time of night, especially with the waves crashing violently against the rocks. I felt my pulse quicken, my hands trembling as I stepped back from the window. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move toward the door. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more the image of the figure stayed with me, lurking in the corner of my mind, refusing to leave. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, trying to calm my breathing. Then, with a deep breath, I stepped outside, making my way down the stone steps to the lighthouse base. The figure was gone. It was strange, but I brushed it off. After all, it was late, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. But that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was watching me. That was the first night things started to change. The first time I truly felt the presence of the lighthouse. And the first time I began to question whether the things I was experiencing were just a product of my imagination, or something far more sinister. It was a week after the strange encounter with the figure on the rocks that I started to notice the first real signs of something being wrong at the lighthouse. At first, they were subtle, barely noticeable, things that could easily be explained away by the wind, my tiredness, or simple coincidence. But as they began to happen more frequently, I realized that I couldn't just brush them off. The first sign came one afternoon when I was inside, making my usual rounds, checking the lantern room, and making sure everything was secure. The sunlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting long shadows across the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the room felt heavier than usual. As I was wiping down the surfaces, I heard something, a distinct scraping noise. It came from behind me, from the far corner of the room where the old wooden cupboard stood. I turned, half expecting to find a pile of debris or a stray branch from a tree brushing against the wall. But there was nothing. I stood still, listening. The silence returned, and I shook my head, convinced it was nothing more than the wind, or perhaps a creaky floorboard settling. I went back to my work, but a sense of unease began to creep over me. The sensation was faint, but it lingered, like an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. The next morning, I went to the base of the lighthouse to check the grounds for any maintenance work that needed to be done. It was another calm day, the sky overcast, the sea calm as usual. As I walked around the perimeter, I noticed something odd. There was a set of footprints leading from the rocks to the lighthouse door. The prints were fresh, and the way they were placed, almost as if they were deliberately arranged, sent a chill through me. I knelt down to inspect them more closely. The prints were large, too large to be anyone from the small town nearby. They were deep, as if the person who made them weighed more than the average person, and they seemed to circle around the base of the lighthouse. My heart raced, my mind spinning. I was sure that no one had been here. No one had entered the lighthouse since the day it arrived, and the door had been locked. There was no way someone had slipped past me. I checked the locks again, ensuring they were secure, and decided to let it go. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe some stray animal had wandered close, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The unsettling feeling grew worse that night. I had just finished my usual evening routine of cleaning and checking the lights when I decided to head to bed early. The storm clouds had rolled in, and I could hear the distant rumble of thunder. The wind howled outside, making the windows rattle in their frames. The sound was deafening, but oddly soothing, as if the world outside was being swept into a storm that I couldn't touch. I lay in bed, trying to calm my mind, but sleep wouldn't come. It wasn't the storm that kept me awake, though. It was the sense that someone, or something, was out there, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I listened to the wind and the rain batter against the lighthouse. And then, Through the din of the storm, I heard something else. A faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind again, maybe a branch or debris hitting the windows, but the sound was too deliberate. It was almost like someone was knocking on the walls of the lighthouse. I held my breath, straining to hear. The tapping continued, growing louder, closer. My mind raced. Was someone out there? Was there someone knocking on the door? I didn't move. I couldn't. The noise seemed to come from all directions at once, above me, behind me, and even beneath the floor. It felt as if the lighthouse itself was alive, sending some kind of warning. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the tapping to stop. But it didn't. It lasted for hours, until finally, it ceased just before dawn. I didn't even realize I had fallen asleep until I awoke the next morning, my body stiff and aching from the tension I had held in my muscles throughout the night. The next day, I checked the walls, the floors, and the windows. There was no sign of anything unusual. The lighthouse was as it always had been, silent, empty, and cold. I convinced myself that the storm had caused the sounds, that perhaps the wind had created the eerie tapping effect. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse was trying to communicate with me in some way that I didn't understand. I tried to go about my work, ignoring the growing sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences only intensified. One morning, I went to the kitchen to make breakfast, and when I opened the cupboard, I found that all the dishes inside had been carefully stacked in a way that was impossible for them to have fallen into on their own. It was as if someone had moved them, arranged them. I couldn't explain it. I tried to reassure myself that I had simply forgotten how I'd left them the night before, but the more I thought about it, the less I believed that explanation. The unsettling events kept happening, scratching noises on the walls, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and the feeling of being watched. I tried to dismiss it all, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. I had a conversation with the locals, asking if anyone else had ever experienced anything strange at the lighthouse. They looked at me with confusion and shrugged, as if the place were no more unusual than any other building by the sea. But there was something in their eyes, a knowing look, that told me they knew more than they were letting on. That night, as the wind howled and the rain lashed against the lighthouse, I sat in the caretaker's quarters, trying to make sense of everything. That was when I heard it again, the tapping. This time, it was louder. It wasn't just on the walls. It seemed to be coming from within the very structure itself. The floorboards groaned under the weight of whatever was causing the noise. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't keep ignoring it. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up to the lantern room. The storm raged outside, but inside the lighthouse, the air was still, almost too still. The tapping continued, growing louder as I climbed the stairs, until I reached the top, where the source of the sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the ceiling. Something, or someone, was up there. But there was nothing when I looked. No hidden passage, no mysterious presence. Only the empty room, dark and cold. The following days felt like an unending blur of unsettling moments, each one stacking upon the last, until I felt like I was living in a world that no longer made sense. The once comforting routine of lighthouse life, checking the lanterns, inspecting the grounds, and ensuring everything was in order, was now marred by strange occurrences I couldn't explain. What had started as a few odd noises and eerie feelings quickly escalated into something far worse, a constant presence of dread hanging over every corner of the lighthouse. It was in the middle of one particularly stormy afternoon when things began to take a darker turn. I had just finished securing the windows, the wind howling outside like an angry beast, and I was in the kitchen making a quick meal. The rain pounded against the windows with a force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the lighthouse. The fire in the stove crackled and popped, the warmth from the flames offering little comfort against the chill in the air. But even as I stirred the pot on the stove, something felt off. I couldn't place it at first. The room felt wrong, like the walls were closing in on me. My breath quickened, a familiar tightness settling in my chest as I turned toward the door. That's when I saw it. In the doorway to the living room, standing just outside the kitchen, was a shadow. It wasn't like the usual shadows cast by the flickering firelight or the storm outside. This shadow was solid, darker than anything the light could produce. It stood perfectly still, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But when I blinked, it was still there. And then it moved. My pulse spiked, and I backed away from the stove, my heart thudding in my ears. The shadow stepped forward, taking its time as though it were savoring the moment. I couldn't see any details, just a tall, featureless shape, its edges blending into the darkened doorway. I opened my mouth to speak, to shout, to demand that whoever it was reveal themselves, but no words came out. My throat felt dry, constricted, as if the very air around me was thicker than usual. The shadow moved again, and in an instant, it was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. I stood frozen, staring at the empty doorway, my breath coming in sharp gasps. It wasn't until the wind howled louder, rattling the windows once more, that I realized I had been holding my breath. Slowly, I exhaled, but the fear didn't subside. Instead, it deepened, growing like a heavy weight in the pit of my stomach. I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a flickering flame or a gust of wind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The presence in the doorway had been real. And whatever it wasn't human. That night, I found myself staring at the ceiling again, the silence broken only by the creaking of the lighthouse as it swayed with the wind. The storm had passed, but the unease remained. I lay wide-eyed in bed, trying to ignore the tapping that had returned, this time softer, but no less unsettling. I had grown used to the sound, but it wasn't something I could ever ignore. I wanted to believe it was just the house settling, the wind playing tricks on me, but something told me it wasn't. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to shut out the noise, but it only grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the tapping was trying to get my attention, trying to communicate something. I couldn't help but feel that the lighthouse was trying to tell me something, and I was too afraid to listen. The next day, I decided I had had enough. I couldn't go on living like this, constantly on edge, always listening for something that wasn't there, or worse, for something that was. I needed answers. So, I began my investigation. I started by checking the records left behind by the previous lighthouse keeper, hoping that someone else had experienced the same strange occurrences. The records were sparse, but I found a few mentions of odd happenings. There were vague references to strange sounds and unexplained movements of objects, but nothing detailed enough to offer any real explanation. The entries were written hastily, as though the writer had been trying to distance themselves from the events, but it was clear they had been rattled. I moved on to the town itself, speaking to the locals, those who had lived here long enough to know the history of the lighthouse. The responses were always the same. They would tell me the place was old, but nothing out of the ordinary. But when I pressed further, when I mentioned the strange occurrences, there was a shift in their demeanor. They would grow quiet, avoiding eye contact, and then change the subject. I could feel it, a sort of unspoken understanding that there was something more to the lighthouse than anyone was willing to admit. There was one old man, a fisherman, who seemed to know more than he let on. His eyes were clouded with age, but there was a sharpness to his words when he spoke about the lighthouse. He told me stories of the lighthouse being cursed, of sailors lost to the sea, and spirits trapped in the very walls of the tower. I wasn't sure whether he was just telling old ghost stories to entertain me, but there was something in his tone that made me believe he had seen more than he was willing to share. That night, I returned to the lighthouse with a sense of determination. I was going to find out the truth, whether I liked it or not. The wind had picked up again, and the storm clouds were gathering once more, but I didn't care. I had to know. I checked every room, looking for any clues that could explain what was happening. The more I searched, The more I felt like I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with the sensation of unseen eyes following my every move. I made my way to the lantern room, where the tapping had been the loudest the night before. The air was thick up there, almost suffocating, and the room felt colder than it should have been, even with the storm outside. I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the walls, looking for any cracks or signs of disturbance. That's when I found it, a small, almost imperceptible crack in the ceiling, just above the lantern. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my pulse quicken. I reached up, my fingers brushing the edge of the crack. That's when I felt it, a cold, clammy sensation, like something was pressing against my hand from the other side. I jerked my hand back, heart racing. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a hidden passage? Something buried in the walls? I didn't know, but I couldn't ignore it. The crack was no longer just a physical flaw in the building. It was a doorway to something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. That night, the tapping was louder than ever, but I didn't dare move. I stayed in the lantern room, staring at the crack in the ceiling, waiting. I don't know what I was waiting for, but as the storm raged outside, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone in that lighthouse. The night had descended upon the lighthouse like a suffocating blanket. The storm outside now nothing more than a distant rumble. Inside, the only sound was the soft crackle of the fire in the stove and the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. But despite the calm on the surface, the air was thick with an unnerving sense of anticipation. I had been staring at the crack in the ceiling for hours, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The tapping had stopped, and I thought maybe the strange occurrences would fade as the night wore on. But I knew better. The silence felt too deliberate, like it was setting the stage for something far worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse itself was watching me, waiting. It was almost as if the walls were closing in on me, the very structure of the building conspiring to keep me trapped. But I had made a decision. I was going to find out what was behind that crack, no matter the cost. If I had to face whatever haunted this place, so be it. I couldn't live in fear any longer. With a deep breath, I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the lantern room. The narrow stairs creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, each step sending a shiver of dread down my spine. The air was colder now, almost unnaturally so, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders. As I reached the top, I turned the flashlight toward the ceiling, where the crack was still there, mocking me. It hadn't grown any larger, but I could sense something was different. Something had changed. I raised my hand toward the crack again, the same cold sensation from before washing over me. I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew that touching it again was a dangerous move, but there was no turning back now. My fingers brushed the edge of the crack, and that's when it happened. The air in the room shifted. The temperature plummeted, and I felt a gust of wind rush past me, even though there were no windows open. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting the room in an eerie half-light. The crack in the ceiling began to widen, slowly at first, then faster, until a thick, black mist began to pour out from within. The mist twisted and writhed like it had a life of its own, curling around the room, filling the air with a suffocating heaviness. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The mist was thick now, swirling around my feet, and I could feel something malevolent, pushing against the air, trying to reach out, trying to get closer. I tried to turn, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot by an overwhelming sense of dread. And then I heard it. A voice. Low, guttural, and distorted. It echoed through my mind, reverberating in the walls of the lighthouse. It wasn't a voice I could understand, but it was unmistakably there, whispering words I couldn't comprehend. The sound crawled into my ears, burrowing deep into my thoughts, and I felt the walls of the lighthouse shake, the floor beneath my feet vibrating with the force of it. My body felt like it was being pulled toward the crack, as if some invisible force was guiding me, urging me to step closer. I resisted with everything I had, my body trembling, but I couldn't fight the pull. My feet moved of their own accord, dragging me closer to the mist, to whatever lay beyond the crack. The moment I crossed the threshold, the room seemed to shift. The walls blurred, the air growing thick with the scent of decay. I couldn't see anything beyond the swirling blackness, but I could feel something ancient and hungry, pressing in on me from all sides. The mist began to take shape, slowly, like it was solidifying, forming into a figure. It was tall, towering over me, its features obscured by the swirling darkness. But I could feel its eyes on me, cold, unfeeling, and full of malice. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure reached out, its hand a dark silhouette against the mist, and I felt a coldness unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if the very essence of death was touching me, reaching deep into my soul, pulling at something I didn't even know existed. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, choked with fear. The figure's hand hovered just inches from my face, and I could see its outline more clearly now. Sharp, angular features that didn't seem human, its body shifting and warping as though it wasn't truly there. I felt its presence filling the room, suffocating me, drowning me in its power. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The mist dissipated as quickly as it had come, leaving nothing but a heavy silence behind. The crack in the ceiling was closed, and the room felt still, almost unnaturally so. My body felt like it had been drained of all energy, like I had just run a marathon. My legs buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I stayed there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. What was that thing? What had I just encountered? And why had it chosen me? The fire in the stove had long since died down, and the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the wind outside. The first rays of dawn crept through the thick curtains, casting a pale light across the room. But I couldn't feel the warmth of the sun. The terror, the coldness, the suffocating dread, everything from the night before lingered like an unshakable weight. I had barely slept. The images of the mist and the shadowy figures seared into my mind. I couldn't escape them. No matter where I turned, it felt like the presence of whatever haunted that lighthouse was still there, watching, waiting for me to slip up. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. Something had changed, something that went beyond the strange occurrences. It wasn't just the lighthouse that had become a prison, it was my mind. I felt as though I was unraveling, my thoughts fractured, my grip on reality slipping with every passing moment. The figure, the voice, the mist, it wasn't just a haunting. It was a warning, a curse, and I had no intention of letting it claim me as its next victim. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, my body heavy with exhaustion. The events of the night seemed too real, too vivid, to ignore, yet the sunlight streaming into the room gave everything an almost surreal, dreamlike quality. Was it all just a nightmare? Or had I truly encountered something beyond explanation? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I needed to leave. The thought of escaping the lighthouse felt like a lifeline, but there was a part of me that feared I wouldn't be able to escape whatever held it in its grip. I moved to the small window and peered outside. The ocean stretched out before me, vast and endless, the wind whipping the waves into a frenzy. It was a world far removed from the terror I had experienced inside. But that was just it. No matter how far I went, no matter where I ran, I knew the truth. Whatever had happened in that lighthouse would never truly leave me. The darkness had already taken root. It was inside me now. I grabbed my bag, stuffing it with whatever few belongings I had left, the few things that felt like they could anchor me to reality. I paused at the door for a moment, the sound of my own breathing too loud in the silence. The air was thick again, almost oppressive, as if the lighthouse was trying to hold me in place, prevent me from leaving. For a moment, I almost turned back. Maybe it was fear that kept me there, or maybe it was some twisted part of me that wanted to understand what was happening, wanted to confront it. But the fear won out. There was no more time to question. It was time to go. I stepped out into the hall, my footsteps slow and cautious. The lighthouse felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, less alive, but there was still a chill in the air, a feeling that I wasn't alone. The sounds of the storm from the previous night had faded, but the silence was just as heavy. I walked quickly, trying to keep my focus, trying not to let my mind wander back to what I had seen, what I had felt. As I descended the stairs to the entrance, a strange thought occurred to me. What if I wasn't meant to leave? What if I was being watched even now, every step I took part of some twisted plan? The thought made my stomach churn, and I hurried my pace. I reached the front door and hesitated, my hand on the handle. For the briefest moment, I felt a tug at my chest, an invisible force trying to hold me back. My heart raced, my breath shallow as I forced myself to turn the handle. The door creaked open, and the outside world greeted me with the salty breeze and the sunlight that felt foreign after such a long night of terror. I stepped outside, taking in the vastness of the ocean once more. The lighthouse loomed behind me, its silhouette stark against the sky. It was just a building now, a structure that had been a prison for far too long. And yet, as I looked back one last time, I could feel the weight of its gaze upon me. I wasn't free, not really. The fear still clung to me like a shadow, and I knew that the curse of the lighthouse would follow me for as long as I lived. I walked away, my footsteps steady, but my mind still reeling from everything I had experienced. As I made my way down the path toward the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The wind whispered around me, and for a brief second, I thought I heard the faintest sound, like a voice, calling my name. But when I turned, there was nothing. I didn't stop to look again. I kept walking, my pace quickening as I made my way down the winding path that led to the town. The further I got, the more the sense of unease seemed to fade, like the lighthouse was losing its grip on me. But I knew better. The lighthouse wasn't just a building. It was a thing of darkness, a thing of old, twisted power. And though I had left it behind, I knew that I hadn't truly escaped. The sun had begun to set as I reached the outskirts of town, casting long shadows that stretched across the empty streets. The warmth of the evening was in stark contrast to the cold chill that had wrapped itself around my heart ever since leaving the lighthouse. Every part of me wanted to believe that it was all over, that the haunting presence had been left behind with the crumbling walls and forgotten hallways. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no escaping it. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse still held its grasp on me, like an invisible chain around my chest. Even now, as I stood in the middle of a town that seemed so ordinary, so safe, I felt it, the oppressive weight of something watching, waiting. Every person I passed seemed a little too still, too quiet, and I couldn't help but wonder if they knew. If they had ever heard the stories, if they too had felt the same pull, the same terror. The memories of the mist, of the shadow that had emerged from the darkness, played over and over in my mind like a broken record. No matter how much I tried to push them away, they came rushing back, each image more vivid, more haunting than the last. And the voice that had called to me, taunting and demanding, I couldn't forget it, no matter how much I wished I could. The people of the town spoke little to me, their glances fleeting, as if they knew better than to acknowledge the stranger who had just appeared on their doorstep. There was an unspoken understanding, a shared silence that seemed to bind us all together in some way. They didn't need to ask me what had happened, they already knew. They'd seen it before, heard the whispers in the dark, felt the dread seep into their bones. I stayed for a few days, but every night was the same. I would try to sleep, but the dreams would come, vivid and unrelenting. The lighthouse, always just out of reach, always calling me back. The face of the shadow, twisted and inhuman, would fill my thoughts, and the weight of its presence would follow me into the waking world. It was like I could still feel the cold touch of its fingers against my skin, its hollow gaze burning into me from the depths of my memory. I tried to escape it. I left the town, traveled to new places, hoping that the further I went, the less I would be haunted. But it didn't work. The lighthouse was always there, lingering at the edges of my thoughts. Sometimes, when the wind would howl through the trees or the waves would crash against the shore, I would hear it, faint whispers in the wind, calling my name. I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was both. The more I tried to run, the more it seemed to follow. It's been years since I left that place, but it's never truly left me. Every time I close my eyes, I see the lighthouse. Every time I feel the chill in the air or hear the waves crashing against the shore, I feel it, its presence, always just out of reach, yet never truly gone. I've come to accept it, in a way. It's become a part of me, like an old wound that never fully heals, always throbbing in the background, always there, whether I acknowledge it or not. But even now, as I sit here and reflect on everything that happened, I can't help but wonder, what was it? What did we encounter there, in that forsaken place? Was it something born of the earth, something ancient that had been waiting for someone to stumble upon it? Or was it something else, something far more sinister, that had been watching us, drawing us in from the moment we stepped foot on that cursed land? I don't have the answers. I probably never will. But I know one thing for sure. The lighthouse isn't just a place. It's a feeling, a presence, and no matter how far I run, no matter how many years pass, it will always be with me.